Yeah. YouTube listeners, welcome back to our podcast, brought to you by the wonderful folks at Jet Off, where we're always bringing up a storm of fun and knowledge. We're super to dive into a fascinating comparison of two countries that might just surprise you.
You know what's even more exciting? The fact that we're finally getting back to our normal schedule after that crazy week where I spilled coffee all over my notes. And Mira here managed to turn it into a hilarious story about coffee chic.
I guess that's one way to get a caffeine boost. But anyway, let's move on to the good stuff. We're exploring the wonderful world of Denmark and El Salvador. Now, I know what's the connection between these two countries. Well, let me tell you, it's not just about the delicious pastries and vibrant cultures. We're going to dive deep into the nitty-gritty of everyday life, from safety and economy to education and tourism.
That's right. And with this podcast, we're not just giving you a superficial tour of these countries. We're going to be your comprehensive guide, answering all the questions that might be buzzing in your mind if you're considering visiting, living, or even marrying someone from one of these countries.
Exactly. And don't worry, we're not going to leave you hanging. We'll cover everything from the cost of living, transportation, and food to the nightlife, family-friendly activities, and even the language barrier.
Oh, yes. And let's not forget about the language barrier. I mean, have you ever tried to order a simple coffee in Danish? It's like trying to decipher a secret code. Trust me.
Yeah, I can imagine. But don't worry, we'll make sure to give you all the tips and tricks you need to navigate these languages like a pro.
So, without further ado, let's get started on this amazing journey of discovery. And remember, if you're new to our podcast, welcome. We're glad to have you on board. And if you're a seasoned listener, well, we're glad to have you back.
That's right. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more exciting content like this. We'll be back with more fun and knowledge in just a minute. Stay tuned.
And before we go, let me just say that I'm super to share my own experiences with you all. I mean, who wouldn't want to hear about my adventures in Copenhagen and San Salvador?
Yeah, I'm sure our listeners are just dying to know about your exploits. But don't worry, we'll make sure to keep it entertaining and informative.
Thanks, Nira. And speaking of which, let's get started on this podcast and see what kind of laughter and learning we can share with you all today. Well,
that's right. And remember, if you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, feel free to leave them in the comments section below. We'll do our best to answer them in future episodes.
And don't forget to follow us on social media for more updates and behind-the-scenes fun. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, so be sure to check us out and give us a shout-out.
That's right. And with that, let's get started on our comparison of Denmark and El Salvador. It's going to be a wild ride, folks, so buckle up and get ready for some serious fun and knowledge. Oh, I'm so to dive into the topic of general safety and crime rates for Denmark and El Salvador. I'm certain our listeners living in these countries would agree with me that safety is a top priority.
Absolutely. Mira. And what better way to start than with some fascinating statistics? Denmark has one of the lowest crime rates in the world, with a homicide rate of only 0.5 per 100. So I think that we can conquer that, 0 people. That's almost unheard of.
Well, that's incredible. And what about El Salvador? I've heard that it has a much higher crime rate. Can you tell us a bit more about the situation there?
Yes, unfortunately. El Salvador has struggled with high levels of violence and crime in recent years. The homicide rate is significantly higher, with over 50 murders per 100. So I think that we can conquer that. 0 people. But, as we all know, there's more to the story than just numbers.
That's right. And I'm curious to know more about the cultural factors that contribute to these differences. In Denmark, for example, I've heard that the concept of HYGCGE plays a big role in promoting a sense of safety and community.
Ah, yes. HYGG is indeed a unique aspect of Danish culture. It's all about creating a cozy and welcoming atmosphere, which helps to foster a sense of trust and belonging among neighbors. But in El Salvador, the concept of barrio is more relevant. It's a strong sense of community and loyalty among neighbors that can actually work against the interests of law enforcement.
I see what you mean. It's fascinating to see how different cultural contexts can shape the way people perceive safety and security. And what about the role of law enforcement in these countries? How do they approach crime prevention and response?
Well, in Denmark, the police force is highly respected and trusted by the public. They have a strong focus on community policing and work closely with social services to address underlying issues that may contribute to crime.
That's great to hear. And in El Salvador, I've heard that the police force is also working to improve their response to crime. But it's a much more complex situation due to the high levels of violence and corruption.
Exactly. And it's not just the police force that's affected. The entire justice system in El Salvador is struggling to cope with the high levels of violence and crime. But, as we all know, there are always glimmers of hope.
Absolutely. And I'm curious to know more about the ways in which ordinary people are contributing to the safety and security of their communities in both Denmark and El Salvador. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes. In Denmark. For example, there are many community-led initiatives that promote safety and security, such as neighborhood watch programs and volunteer-led safety patrols.
That's great to hear. And in El Salvador, I've heard that there are also many community-led initiatives, but they often face significant challenges due to the high levels of violence and corruption.
Yes, it's a very complex situation. But, as we all know, the power of community and grassroots initiatives can be a game changer.
I completely agree. And speaking of community, I'm curious to know more about the role of women in promoting safety and security in both Denmark and El Salvador. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes. Women have played a crucial role in promoting safety and security in both countries. In Denmark, for example, there are many women-led initiatives that focus on preventing violence against women and promoting women's empowerment.
That's wonderful to hear. And in El Salvador, I've heard that women are also playing a key role in promoting safety and security, particularly in the context of the high levels of violence against women.
Yes, it's a very important issue, and I'm glad to see that there are many women-led initiatives and organizations working to address this issue.
I completely agree. And finally, I'd like to ask our listeners, what do you think are the most important factors in promoting safety and security in Denmark and El Salvador? Do you have any personal experiences or insights to share?
Yes. I'm sure our listeners would love to share their thoughts and experiences. And who knows, maybe we'll even learn something new and valuable from each other.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for tuning in. And we'll see you in the next episode. I'm fascinated by Denmark's reputation for being one of the most stable and peaceful countries in the world. Can you imagine living in a place where the police are more like community helpers than enforcers?
Yes. It's a unique system indeed. In Denmark, the police are often seen as social workers rather than just law enforcers. I'm curious, Mira, have you ever been to a country where the police are more like friends than authority figures?
Actually, I have. In El Salvador, the police are more like a community resource. They're not just there to enforce laws, but also to help with everyday issues like finding lost children or resolving disputes between neighbors. It's amazing to see how community-oriented they are.
That's incredible. I can imagine how that would make a big difference in people's lives. But what about the government's role in promoting social harmony? How does Denmark's system compare to El Salvador's?
Well, Denmark has a strong tradition of social democracy, which emphasizes the importance of social welfare and equality. They have a robust social safety net, and their government is committed to reducing poverty and inequality. In contrast, El Salvador has a more complex system, with a mix of socialist and capitalist elements.
That's an interesting contrast. I've heard that Denmark has a high level of social cohesion, with people from different backgrounds coming together to build a sense of community. Can you tell me more about that?
Yes, that's true. Denmark has a strong culture of community engagement, with many people participating in volunteer work and community projects. It's not uncommon to see people from different backgrounds working together to build a community center or organize a cultural event. It's really inspiring to see how they prioritize social cohesion.
Wow, that's amazing. I can see why Denmark is often cited as a model for social harmony. But what about El Salvador? How does their system promote social harmony?
Well, El Salvador has a rich cultural heritage, with many festivals and traditions that bring people together. For example, their famous Fiestas de San Salvador is a massive celebration that draws people from all over the country. It's a time for people to come together, share food and music, and celebrate their culture.
That sounds incredible. I can imagine how that would be a powerful way to build social bonds and promote community spirit. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about how they can experience that for themselves.
Absolutely. If you're living in or planning to visit El Salvador, I highly recommend attending one of their many festivals and cultural events. It's a great way to experience the local culture and connect with the community.
That's a great tip, Mira. And speaking of tips, I'm curious, what do you think are some of the key factors that contribute to social harmony in Denmark?
Well, I think one of the most important factors is the emphasis on social equality and fairness. Denmark's system prioritizes the well-being of all citizens, regardless of their background or socio-economic status. That creates a sense of trust and cooperation among people.
That makes sense. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about how they can apply those principles in their own lives. For more insights like this, don't forget to check out Jetoff AI, where you can find expert analysis and advice on everything from social harmony to expat living.
Great suggestion. Leo, and speaking of applying those principles, I think it's worth noting that Denmark's system is not without its challenges. For example, they have a high level of taxation to fund their social welfare system.
That's a great point, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about how they can navigate those challenges and still enjoy the benefits of living in a stable and peaceful country. If you have any tips or advice on that, feel free to share in the comments below.
Actually, I do have some tips. In Denmark, it's not uncommon for people to participate in volunteer work or community projects to give back to their community. It's a great way to build connections and contribute to social harmony.
That's a wonderful idea, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about how they can get involved in similar projects in their own communities. Let's wrap up this topic by saying that both Denmark and El Salvador offer unique perspectives on social harmony and community engagement.
Absolutely, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's essential to prioritize social cohesion and community spirit in our own lives. Whether you're living in a stable and peaceful country like Denmark or a more complex system like El Salvador, there are always ways to build connections and promote social harmony.
Well said, Mira. And finally, I'd like to ask our listeners, what do you think are some of the key factors that contribute to social harmony in your own community? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And let's continue the conversation on social media using the hashtag social harmony.
Type into the economic conditions and cost of living in Denmark. One of the things that's often mentioned is the high cost of living. But is it really that bad?
I'm sure our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me that it's not all about the expensive coffee and pastries. The Danes have a solid job market, with a high level of employment and a strong social safety net.
That's true. But have you ever tried to buy a house in Copenhagen? It's like trying to buy a luxury car. It's completely out of reach for most people.
Well, I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's not just about buying a house, but also about the overall quality of life. Denmark has a high standard of living, with access to excellent healthcare, education, and infrastructure.
Exactly. And speaking of education, have you heard about the Danish concept of flexitime? It's a system that allows employees to work flexible hours, which is great for work-life balance.
Ah, yes. I've heard about that. It's actually a great way to balance work and personal life. But let's talk about the cost of living in Denmark. What's the average salary for a person living in Copenhagen?
Well, according to various sources, the average salary in Copenhagen is around 55 Zara DKK per month. But, of course, that's not the only thing to consider when about cost of living.
That's true. The cost of living in Denmark can be quite high, especially when it comes to housing, food, and transportation. But, on the other hand, Denmark has a high level of social security, which can help offset some of those costs.
Absolutely. And speaking of social security, have you heard about the Danish concept of dagpenge? It's a system that provides financial support to employees who are on parental leave.
Ah, yes. I've heard about that. It's actually a great way to support families and encourage work-life balance. But let's talk about the cost of living in El Salvador. What's it like living in a country with a lower cost of living?
Well, El Salvador has a relative living compared to Denmark. According to various sources, the average salary in El Salvador is around 500 USD per month.
Wow, that's a significant difference. But, of course, the cost of living in El Salvador can vary depending on the location and lifestyle.
Exactly. And speaking of lifestyle, have you heard about the concept of pura vida in El Salvador? It's a way of life that emphasizes living in the present and appreciating the simple things.
Yes. I've heard about that. It's actually a great way to approach life, and it's something that many people in El Salvador take pride in.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried to navigate the streets of San Salvador? It's like a whole different world compared to Copenhagen.
Yes. I have tried to navigate the streets of San Salvador, and it was definitely an adventure. But I have to say, the people of El Salvador are some of the friendliest and most welcoming I've ever met.
That's so true. And speaking of people, have you heard about the concept of family in El Salvador? It's a very important part of the culture, and family is often considered to be the most important thing in life.
Ah, yes. I've heard about that. It's actually a great way to approach family, and it's something that many people in El Salvador take pride in.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today's topic. I'm curious, what do our listeners think about the economic conditions and cost of living in Denmark and El Salvador?
I'm sure our listeners would love to share their thoughts and experiences. Let's hear from them in the comments section.
Dive into the world of accommodation options in Denmark and El Salvador. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever had any close calls with housing in these countries?
Actually, Mira, I once stayed in a tiny apartment in Copenhagen with a roommate who snored like a chainsaw. I'm sure our listeners can relate to the importance of a good night's sleep.
Oh, for you. I'm sure you handled it like a pro. In Denmark, expats often face high costs for housing, especially in major cities like Copenhagen. What's your take on the situation, Leo?
Well, it's not just the cost that's the issue. Mira, the Danish concept of Hygge coziness often comes with a price tag. You'll find yourself paying extra for a cozy apartment with a fireplace or a view of the harbor.
I see what you mean. It's all about the experience, right? But what about Salvador? I've heard that the country has a growing expat community, particularly in San Salvador and Antigua.
Yes, that's true. Mira, El Salvador has a relatively affordable housing market, especially compared to Denmark. However, the quality of housing can vary greatly, and it's essential to research thoroughly before renting or buying.
I agree. In both countries, it's crucial to understand the local real estate market and what to expect in terms of prices and quality. let's talk about some of the unique accommodation options in Denmark, like the concept of collective housing.
Yes. Collective housing is a fascinating topic. Mira, essentially, it's a shared living space where residents come together to share meals, chores, and social activities. It's a great way to experience Danish culture and meet like-minded people.
That sounds amazing. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about this concept. In El Salvador, I've heard that some expats opt for finca living, which is a rural homestead-style accommodation.
Yes, finca living is a great option for those who want to experience the country's natural beauty and immerse themselves in local culture. However, it's essential to be aware of the challenges that come with living off the grid, such as limited access to amenities and internet.
I see what you mean. It's all about finding the right balance between comfort and immersion in the local culture. What do you think about the importance of language skills when it comes to finding accommodation in both countries? Leo?
Well, Mira, language skills are crucial when searching for accommodation in both Denmark and El Salvador. While some locals may speak English, it's still essential to learn the local language to navigate the housing market effectively.
Absolutely. Leo, language skills can make all the difference in finding the right accommodation and navigating the local culture. I'm curious, have you ever had any funny experiences with language barriers while searching for accommodation?
Oh, yes. Mira, I once tried to rent an apartment in Copenhagen using only Google Translate, and let's just say it was an interesting experience. I ended up with a great apartment, but I had to negotiate the price in Danish, which was a challenge.
Oh, Leo, you're a true adventurer. I'm sure our listeners can relate to the importance of being flexible and adaptable when searching for accommodation abroad.
Well, Mira, I think that's the key to successful expat living, being open-minded and willing to learn. And, of course, having a good sense of humor doesn't hurt either.
Absolutely. Leo, and speaking of humor, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear some funny stories about accommodation mishaps in both countries. Do you have any? Leo?
Well, Mira, I do have a few stories up my sleeve. But let's just say that I've had my fair share of interesting experiences with accommodation in both Denmark and El Salvador.
Oh, I'm sure our listeners are dying to hear them. Leo. But for now, let's wrap up our discussion on accommodation options and quality in Denmark and El Salvador. Thanks for sharing your insights. Leo!
No problem. Mira, it's been a pleasure discussing this topic with you. And to our listeners. Don't forget to share your own accommodation experiences and tips in the comments below.
And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more content on expat living and travel. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. I'm certain that our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me that the country's bureaucracy can be quite, let's say, inviting. Leo, what's your take on the Danish visa process?
Mira, you're being the kind. Denmark's bureaucracy is a whole different ball game. But I guess it's all worth it for the stunning fjords and cozy pastries. Seriously though, the Danish government has made efforts to simplify the visa process, but it still requires a lot of paperwork and documentation.
That's true. But have you heard about the new self-service portal for visa applications in Denmark? It's like a game changer for expats. You can submit your application, pay the fee, and even track the status of your application online.
Wow, that's impressive. But I'm curious, how user-friendly is it really? I've heard horror stories about the Danish bureaucracy being a bit finicky.
Well, I'm sure it's not perfect, but from what I've heard, the self-service portal is quite intuitive. Plus, if you do encounter any issues, you can always contact the Danish embassy or consulate for assistance.
That's reassuring. But let's talk about El Salvador. I've heard that the country is a relatively straightforward visa process, especially for tourists. What's the deal with that? Mira?
Yes. El Salvador is definitely a country that welcomes tourists with open arms. The visa process is relatively simple, and you can even apply for a visa online. Plus, The country has a lot to offer, from beautiful beaches to volcanic landscapes.
That sounds amazing. But what about the official procedures in El Salvador? I've heard that the country has a bit of a reputation for being, let's say, relaxed when it comes to paperwork.
Well, I think that's a bit of an understatement, Leo. But, in all seriousness, El Salvador does have a more relaxed attitude towards paperwork. However, it's still essential to follow the proper procedures and obtain the necessary documents to avoid any issues.
I see. And what about the language barrier in El Salvador? I've heard that many locals speak English, but it's still a good idea to learn some Spanish to navigate the official procedures.
Absolutely. While many locals in El Salvador speak English, it's still a good idea to learn some Spanish to get around and deal with official procedures. Plus, it's always appreciated when foreigners make an effort to learn the local language.
That's a great point, Mira. And, I'm curious, what's the best way for our listeners to navigate the official procedures in El Salvador? Are there any resources or tips you can share with us?
Well, one thing that's helpful is to research the official government websites of the El Salvadoran embassies and consulates. They often have a wealth of information on the visa process, immigration requirements, and other official procedures.
Oh, that's a great tip. Mira, and what about the Danish government websites? Are they also a good resource for expats?
Yes, absolutely. The Danish government websites are a great resource for expats, with information on visa applications, residence permit, and other official procedures.
I'm sure our listeners would appreciate that. And finally, what's the most important thing to remember when navigating the official procedures in both Denmark and El Salvador?
Well, Leo, I think the most important thing to remember is to be patient and flexible. Bureaucracy can be unpredictable, and things don't always go as planned. But with the right attitude and a bit of humor, you can navigate even the most complex official procedures.
Well, Mira, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. And to our listeners, I'm sure they'll appreciate the practical tips and advice you shared with us today.
Thanks, Leo. And to our listeners, don't forget to share your own experiences and tips in the comments section. We'd love to hear about your adventures in Denmark and El Salvador. So, let's talk about healthcare in Denmark. I've heard it's one of the best in the world. What do you think, Leo? Does it live up to its reputation?
Yeah. Denmark's healthcare system is like a well-oiled machine. They have a strong public healthcare system, and most people have access to quality care. I mean, they even have a law that guarantees everyone's right to healthcare.
That's amazing! And what about the quality of care? I've heard they have some of the best doctors and hospitals in the world.
Absolutely. Danish doctors are highly trained, and the hospitals are state-of-the-art. Plus, they have a strong focus on preventative care, so they're always trying to prevent illnesses before they become a problem.
That's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me that the healthcare system is excellent. But, Leo, what about the cost? I've heard it's not cheap.
Yeah. Denmark's healthcare system is actually quite expensive. But, you get what you pay for. And, as a resident, you're usually covered by the public system, so you don't have to worry about the cost.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about El Salvador? What's the healthcare situation like there?
Well, El Salvador has a bit of a different story. Their healthcare system is still developing, and it's not as robust as Denmark's. But they're making progress, and there are some great hospitals and doctors in the country.
I see. And what about the cost of healthcare in El Salvador? I've heard it's a lot cheaper than in Denmark.
Yeah. El Salvador's healthcare is definitely more affordable. But, the quality of care might not be as high as in Denmark. Still, it's a great option for people who need basic care.
Okay, that's good to know. And I'm curious, Leo, had you ever experienced healthcare in El Salvador? What was your impression?
Yeah, I am. And, you know, it was a bit of a culture shock for me. But the people were friendly, and the doctors were professional. And, hey, it's not all bad. They even have some great coffee in the country.
Well, that's good to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the healthcare system in El Salvador. So, Leo, can you tell us a bit more about your experience?
Sure thing. So, I was there for a few weeks, and I had to visit the hospital a few times. And, you know, it was a bit of a challenge. But the doctors were great. And, hey, they even had a great sense of humor. They were laughing with me. Not at me.
Well, that's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural aspects of healthcare in El Salvador. So, Leo, what was your impression of the hospital culture?
Yeah. The hospital culture in El Salvador is definitely unique. They have a strong focus on family, and the doctors and nurses are always very friendly. And, hey, they even have some great food in the hospital cafeteria.
Well, that's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the healthcare system in Denmark. So, Leo, can you tell us a bit more about the cultural aspects of healthcare in Denmark?
Sure thing. So, in Denmark, the healthcare system is very focused on preventative care, and the doctors are always trying to prevent illnesses before they become a problem. And, hey, they even have some great public health campaigns to promote healthy living.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the healthcare system in El Salvador. So, Leo, what about the government's role in healthcare? How does the government support the healthcare system?
Yeah. The government plays a big role in El Salvador's healthcare system. They provide funding for hospitals and healthcare services. And they also have some great programs to promote healthcare and prevent illnesses.
Okay, that's good to know. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the healthcare system in Denmark. So, Leo, can you tell us a bit more about the government's role in healthcare?
Sure thing. So, in Denmark, the government provides funding for the healthcare system. And they also have some great programs to promote healthcare and prevent illnesses. And, hey, they even have some great public health campaigns to promote healthy living.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the healthcare system in El Salvador. So, Leo, what about the role of insurance in healthcare? Is it necessary to have insurance in El Salvador?
Yeah. Insurance is not necessary in El Salvador, but it's highly recommended. The government provides some free healthcare services, but you might need to pay for private insurance to get access to better care.
Okay, that's good to know. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the healthcare system in Denmark. So, Leo, can you tell us a bit more about the role of insurance in healthcare?
Sure thing. So, in Denmark, you're usually covered by the public healthcare system, so you don't need insurance. But if you want to see a specialist or get private care, you might need to pay for insurance.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the healthcare system in El Salvador. So, Leo, what about the language barrier? Is it a problem for foreigners in El Salvador?
Yeah. The language barrier can be a problem in El Salvador, but many hospitals and healthcare providers have English-speaking staff, so it's not too difficult to get around.
Okay, that's good to know. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the healthcare system in Denmark. So, Leo, can you tell us a bit more about the language barrier in Denmark?
Sure thing. So, in Denmark, most people speak English, especially in the healthcare system. So, it's not too difficult for foreigners to get around.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the healthcare system in El Salvador. So, Leo, what about the quality of care in El Salvador? Is it good?
Yeah. The quality of care in El Salvador is improving, but it's still not as good as in Denmark. But they're making progress, and there are some great doctors and hospitals in the country.
Okay, that's good to know. And let's dive into transportation, infrastructure, and convenience in Denmark and El Salvador. I want to share some interesting facts about both countries. Have you ever wondered how Danes manage their busy cities with such ease?
Yes. I've been there. And I must say, it's quite impressive. The buses and trains are always on time, and the bike lanes are extensive.
Exactly. Denmark has a well-planned public transportation system, making it easy for residents to get around. In fact, Copenhagen has one of the highest rates of bike usage in the world.
That's not surprising, given the city's bike-friendly infrastructure. But let's talk about El Salvador. How do you think their transportation system compares to Denmark's?
Well, El Salvador has made significant improvements in recent years, but it still faces challenges. The country has a relatively small public transportation system, and many residents rely on private vehicles or buses.
That's true. But what about road quality? I've heard that El Salvador's roads can be a bit rough.
Yes, that's correct. El Salvador's roads are often plagued by potholes and uneven surfaces, making travel more difficult. However, the government has invested in improving the road network, especially in major cities like San Salvador.
I see. And what about public transportation in San Salvador? How does it compare to Copenhagen's?
San Salvador has a decent public transportation system, but it's not as efficient as Copenhagen's. The buses can be crowded, and traffic congestion is a significant issue. But I've heard that the city is working to improve its public transportation system, including the introduction of new bus routes and a bike-sharing program.
That's great to hear. I bet our listeners in El Salvador would appreciate hearing about these improvements.
Absolutely. And I'm sure our Danish listeners would be interested in hearing about El Salvador's efforts to improve its transportation system. Speaking of which, have you ever tried navigating El Salvador's roads?
No, I haven't. But I've heard that it can be a challenge.
Yes, it can be. But the scenery is beautiful, and the people are friendly. And did you know that El Salvador has a unique transportation system called camionetas?
What's that?
Camionetas are small, colorful buses that operate on fixed routes, often with a designated time schedule. They're a popular mode of transportation in rural areas.
I've heard of those. They're like the mini buses that operate in many Latin American countries.
Exactly. Camionetas are an integral part of El Salvador's transportation system, and they're often decorated with vibrant colors and music.
That sounds like a fun way to travel. I bet our listeners would love to hear more about these camionetas.
I'll definitely include some photos and videos in the podcast notes, so our listeners can see these colorful buses for themselves. And speaking of transportation, have you ever noticed how El Salvador's roads are often filled with vendors and street food sellers?
Yes, I have. It's a unique aspect of El Salvador's transportation infrastructure.
Yes, it is. And it's a great example of how transportation and commerce can be intertwined. In Denmark, on the other hand, you'll find more bike lanes and pedestrian-friendly areas.
That's right. Copenhagen is a great example of how cities can prioritize bike-friendly infrastructure.
Exactly. And did you know that Copenhagen has a bike-sharing program called Bicyclen?
What's that?
Bicyclen is a bike-sharing program that allows residents and visitors to rent bikes for a small fee. The program has been very successful, and it's a great example of how cities can promote sustainable transportation.
I've heard of that program. It's a great way to get around the city.
Absolutely. And I think our listeners would love to hear more about El Salvador's transportation challenges and how the country is working to improve its infrastructure.
I agree. And Maybe we can even explore some of the unique transportation solutions that El Salvador has implemented.
That's a great idea. Leo! And before we wrap up this topic, let's talk about the role of technology in transportation. How do you think technology can improve transportation infrastructure in both Denmark and El Salvador?
That's a great question. I think technology can play a significant role in improving transportation infrastructure, especially in terms of traffic management and public transportation.
Exactly. And in Denmark, technology has already been implemented to improve traffic flow and reduce congestion.
Yes, that's right. Copenhagen has implemented a smart traffic system that uses data and sensors to optimize traffic flow.
That's fascinating. I think our listeners would love to hear more about how technology can improve transportation infrastructure in both countries.
I agree. And maybe we can even explore some of the innovative transportation solutions that are being implemented in both Denmark and El Salvador.
That's a great idea. Leo, and before we wrap up this topic, let's talk about the impact of transportation on the environment. How do you think transportation can be made more sustainable in both Denmark and El Salvador?
That's a great question. I think sustainable transportation is essential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and promoting eco-friendly practices.
Exactly. And in Denmark, the government has implemented initiatives to promote sustainable transportation, such as increasing the number of electric buses and promoting cycling.
Yes, that's right. Copenhagen is a leader in sustainable transportation, and it's a great example for other cities to follow.
Absolutely. And I think our listeners would love to hear more about El Salvador's efforts to promote sustainable transportation.
And maybe we can even explore some of the innovative transportation solutions that are being implemented in both countries to promote sustainable transportation.
That's a great idea. Leo! And before we wrap up this topic, let's talk about the role of transportation in economic development. How do you think transportation can be used to boost economic growth in both Denmark and El Salvador?
That's a great question. I think transportation can play a significant role in promoting economic growth by connecting businesses and industries to markets and consumers.
Exactly. And in Denmark, the transportation system has been instrumental in promoting economic growth by connecting the country's major cities and ports.
Yes, that's right. Copenhagen is a major hub for trade and commerce, and the transportation system has played a crucial role in its success.
Absolutely. And I think our listeners would love to hear more about El Salvador's efforts to promote economic growth through transportation.
I agree. And maybe we can even explore some of the innovative transportation solutions that are being implemented in both countries to promote economic growth.
That's a great idea. Leo! So, language barriers and ease of communication, it's a crucial aspect of any expat experience. I'm curious to know, Leo, how Denmark fares in this regard. Do you think the language skills of locals make it easier for foreigners to navigate everyday life?
Denmark is a great example of a country with a relatively high proficiency in English, which makes it easier for tourists and expats to communicate. I've heard that many Danes speak English fluently, especially in larger cities like Copenhagen.
That's reassuring to hear. But what about when it comes to more nuanced cultural communication? How do Danes usually interact with foreigners? And what can you expect in terms of hospitality?
Well, the Danes are known for their reserved nature, but that doesn't mean they're not welcoming. In fact, I've found that many Danes are eager to engage in conversations with foreigners, especially if they're interested in learning about their culture.
I can imagine. So, it's a bit of a paradox on the one hand. They're not as outgoing as some other cultures. But, on the other hand, they're happy to chat with foreigners. That must make it easier for expats to settle in.
Exactly. And it's not just about language skills. The Danes also have a strong emphasis on social etiquette, which makes it easier for foreigners to navigate everyday interactions.
That's fascinating. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that Denmark's language skills and cultural norms make it easier or harder for foreigners to communicate?
Ah, I think it's definitely easier. But let's move on to our next country, El Salvador, which is known for having a more complex language landscape.
Yes, I'd love to hear more about that. How does El Salvador compare to Denmark in terms of language barriers and ease of communication?
Well, Spanish is the primary language in El Salvador, and while many locals speak some English, it's not as widespread as in Denmark. However, I've found that many Salvadorans are eager to practice their English skills with foreigners, which can make communication easier.
That's great to hear. But what about cultural communication norms? How do Salvadorans usually interact with foreigners? And what can you expect in terms of hospitality?
The Salvadorans are known for their warm hospitality, which is a big part of their culture. In fact, I've found that many Salvadorans are eager to invite foreigners into their homes and share their food and traditions with them.
That sounds wonderful. So, it's not just about language skills, the Salvadorans also have a strong emphasis on social connections and community.
Exactly. And it's not just about the language, the Salvadorans also have a rich cultural heritage that's worth exploring.
I completely agree. I'm curious to know, Leo, what our listeners think about the language skills and cultural norms in El Salvador. Do you think that they make it easier or harder for foreigners to communicate?
I think it's definitely easier. But let's be real, language barriers can be a challenge in any country. And it's always a good idea to learn a few basic phrases in the local language to show respect and appreciation for the culture.
Absolutely. And speaking of language, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about language learning apps and resources. Do you have any recommendations for learning Spanish or Danish?
I do. There are some great language learning apps out there, such as Duolingo and Babel. And if you're looking for more personalized guidance, you can also try working with a language coach or tutor.
That's a great tip. And finally, I'd like to ask our listeners to share their own experiences with language barriers and ease of communication in Denmark and El Salvador. What were some of the challenges you faced? And how did you overcome them?
I think that's a great way to wrap up our conversation. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more fun and informative conversations about travel and culture.
Dive into the cultural diversity and tolerance in Denmark. I'm curious to know, Leo, what's the secret to their open-mindedness?
Well, I think it's because they have a strong emphasis on social cohesion and community building. They prioritize inclusivity, and it shows in their policies and programs.
That's fascinating. I've heard that Denmark has a unique approach to dealing with cultural differences. They actually have a program called Integration through sports that helps immigrants integrate into Danish society.
Yes, that's right. And it's not just sports. They also have programs for language training, job placement, and even cultural adaptation. It's a very holistic approach.
I'm impressed. And I'm sure our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me that the country's commitment to diversity and inclusion is truly admirable.
Absolutely. And it's not just the government. Danish people themselves are very welcoming and open-minded. I've had some amazing experiences with locals when I visited.
I'm sure you have some great stories to share. Leo! But before we get to that, let's talk about El Salvador. What's the cultural diversity like there?
El Salvador is a fascinating country with a rich cultural heritage. They have a mix of indigenous and Spanish influences, and the country is home to many different ethnic groups.
That's so cool. I've heard that El Salvador has a strong tradition of cultural festivals and celebrations. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, of course. El Salvador has many vibrant festivals throughout the year, including the Fiestas de la Virgen de la Asunción, which is a celebration of the country's patron saint.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the cultural festivals in El Salvador. But let's get back to Denmark for a moment. What do you think is the key to their success in promoting cultural diversity and tolerance?
I think it's a combination of factors, including their strong social safety net, their emphasis on education and language training, and their commitment to community building and social cohesion.
That makes sense. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that education and language training are essential for promoting cultural understanding and tolerance.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the language. It's also about cultural adaptation and understanding. Danish people are very aware of the importance of cultural sensitivity and respect.
I'm sure that's true. And it's not just Denmark. Many countries are working to promote cultural diversity and tolerance. But El Salvador has some unique challenges when it comes to cultural diversity, doesn't it?
Yes, unfortunately. El Salvador has a history of conflict and violence, which has had a significant impact on the country's cultural diversity. However, the country is working to rebuild and promote cultural understanding and tolerance.
I'm sure it's not easy. But it's great to see that the country is working towards a more inclusive and tolerant society. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the cultural diversity in El Salvador.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that both Denmark and El Salvador have a strong sense of community and social cohesion, which is essential for promoting cultural diversity and tolerance.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong commitment to human rights and social justice, which is essential for promoting cultural diversity and tolerance.
Exactly. And it's not just about the laws and policies. It's also about the cultural values and norms that underlie them. In both Denmark and El Salvador, there is a strong emphasis on respect, empathy, and understanding.
I'm sure that's true. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that promoting cultural diversity and tolerance is essential for building a more inclusive and compassionate society.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that both Denmark and El Salvador have a lot to offer in terms of cultural diversity and tolerance. And there's much to learn from both countries.
I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the cultural diversity in both Denmark and El Salvador. And I'm sure we'll be discussing more about this topic in future episodes of the podcast.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that promoting cultural diversity and tolerance is an ongoing process that requires effort and commitment from individuals, communities, and governments alike.
That's a great point. And I think it's also worth noting that promoting cultural diversity and tolerance is not just a moral imperative, but also an economic one. By promoting cultural diversity and tolerance, countries can attract businesses, tourists, and talent from around the world.
Exactly. And it's not just about the economic benefits. It's also about the social benefits of promoting cultural diversity and tolerance. When we promote cultural diversity and tolerance, we create a more inclusive and compassionate society that is better equipped to address the challenges of the 21st century.
I'm sure that's true. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that promoting cultural diversity and tolerance is essential for building a more inclusive and compassionate society.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that promoting cultural diversity and tolerance is not just a responsibility of governments and institutions, but also of individuals. We all have a role to play in promoting cultural diversity and tolerance, whether it's through our words, our actions, or our choices.
I'm sure that's true. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that promoting cultural diversity and tolerance is an ongoing process that requires effort and commitment from all of us.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that promoting cultural diversity and tolerance is not just a moral imperative, but also a matter of personal growth and development. By promoting cultural diversity and tolerance, we can learn more about ourselves and the world around us, and we can become more empathetic and compassionate individuals.
I'm sure that's true. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that promoting cultural diversity and tolerance is essential for building a more inclusive and compassionate society.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that promoting cultural diversity and tolerance is not just a responsibility of governments and institutions, but also of individuals. We all have a role to play in promoting cultural diversity and tolerance, whether it's through our words, our actions, or our choices.
I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the cultural diversity in Denmark and El Salvador. And I'm sure we'll be discussing more about this topic in future episodes of the podcast.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that promoting cultural diversity and tolerance is an ongoing process that requires effort and commitment from individuals, communities, and governments alike.
That's a great point. And I think it's also worth noting that promoting cultural diversity and tolerance is not just a moral imperative, but also an economic one. By promoting cultural diversity and tolerance, countries can attract businesses, tourists, and talent from around the world.
Exactly. Then, it's not.
So, let's talk about educational opportunities in Denmark. I'm curious to know, Leo, how Denmark's educational system compares to El Salvador's.
Well, Mira, Denmark has a reputation for having one of the best education systems in the world. They prioritize hands-on learning and innovative teaching methods, which I think is really interesting.
That's right, Leo. And I've heard that Denmark's literacy rate is also very high. I'm sure our listeners would agree that literacy is a crucial aspect of any education system.
Absolutely. Mira, and speaking of literacy, I've noticed that El Salvador has made significant strides in improving its literacy rate in recent years. It's great to see progress being made in that area.
Yes, it's always exciting to see countries making efforts to improve their education systems. But let's talk about Denmark's approach to education. They seem to focus on practical skills and project-based learning.
That's right, Mira. And I think that's really effective in preparing students for the workforce. Denmark also has a strong emphasis on community service and volunteer work, which I think is great for students to learn about social responsibility.
That's so true, Leo. And I've heard that Denmark's education system is also very inclusive, with a focus on integrating students with disabilities into mainstream classrooms.
Yes, Mira. Denmark has a very progressive approach to education. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that inclusivity is essential in any education system.
Okay, let's talk about El Salvador's education system. I've heard that they have a strong emphasis on bilingual education, with a focus on teaching students both Spanish and English.
That's right, Mira. And I think that's really valuable in preparing students for the global workforce. El Salvador also has a strong tradition of folk music and dance, which is taught in schools as part of the curriculum.
Well, that sounds amazing. Leo, I can imagine that would be a great way to learn about cultural heritage. But let's talk about the challenges facing El Salvador's education system. I've heard that they struggle with teacher shortages and inadequate resources.
Yes, Mira. Those are indeed challenges that El Salvador's education system faces. But it's also worth noting that they've made significant progress in improving access to education, particularly in rural areas.
That's great to hear, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that access to education is a fundamental human right. Okay, let's talk about language schools in Denmark. I've heard that they have a strong focus on language instruction, particularly for international students.
Yes, Mira. Denmark has a number of excellent language schools that cater to international students. And I think it's great that they offer a range of language programs, from beginner to advanced levels.
That's so true, Leo. And I've heard that El Salvador also has a number of language schools that cater to international students. But I'm curious to know, Leo, how Denmark's language schools compare to those in El Salvador.
Well, Mira, Denmark's language schools are generally more expensive than those in El Salvador. But I think they offer a more comprehensive language program, with a focus on cultural immersion and practical skills.
Okay, that's a great point, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that cultural immersion is an essential part of language learning. Okay, let's talk about student testimonials. I've heard that Denmark has a number of success stories from students who have studied in Denmark.
Yes, Mira. Denmark has a number of success stories from students who have studied in Denmark. And I think it's great that they offer a range of scholarships and financial aid to students who cannot afford to study abroad.
That's so true, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that financial aid is essential for students who want to study abroad. Okay, let's wrap up this topic. I'm curious to know, Leo, what are your final thoughts on educational opportunities and language schools in Denmark and El Salvador?
Well, Mira, I think both countries have a lot to offer in terms of educational opportunities and language schools. but I think Denmark's focus on hands-on learning and innovative teaching methods is particularly noteworthy.
I completely agree. Leo? And I think it's great that both countries are making efforts to improve their education systems. Okay, let's move on to the next topic. I'm curious to know, Leo, what's next on our agenda?
Well, Mira, I think we should talk about the cultural differences between Denmark and El Salvador. I've noticed that Denmark has a very relaxed attitude towards life, while El Salvador has a more fast-paced and dynamic culture.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's always fascinating to learn about cultural differences. Okay, let's get started. Let's talk about Denmark and El Salvador in terms of climate and seasonal conditions. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever been to a place where the temperature drops to 20 degrees Celsius in the winter?
Actually, I have. And it's not Denmark. But I've been to some pretty chilly places. But Denmark's winters are indeed cold, especially in the north. They can get pretty dark too, with the shortest day being around 6 hours of daylight.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why people in Denmark love their coffee and candles so much. But El Salvador, on the other hand, has a tropical climate, right? I mean, it's not uncommon to see temperatures soar above 30 degrees Celsius during the dry season.
That's right. And it's not just the temperature, but also the humidity. El Salvador's climate is characterized by two main seasons: the dry season from November to April and the rainy season from May to October. And let me tell you, the rainy season can be quite intense.
I can imagine, but I'm sure the locals are used to it. In Denmark, they have a saying, during VEJU denim, which means there's no way around it. I think that's especially true for the Danes when it comes to dealing with the weather.
That's a great point, Mira. And speaking of dealing with the weather, I've heard that El Salvador is prone to natural disasters like hurricanes and floods. How do you think the locals cope with that?
Well, I think it's all about community and resilience. In El Salvador, people rely heavily on their families and neighbors to support each other during times of crisis. And in Denmark, they have a great social safety net, so people feel secure and supported.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Denmark has a very strong focus on sustainability and renewable energy. They're actually one of the leaders in the world when it comes to wind power.
That's amazing, Leah. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about that. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's possible for El Salvador to adopt similar sustainable practices?
Well, I think it's definitely possible, but it would require a lot of effort and investment. However, El Salvador has made some great strides in recent years, especially when it comes to renewable energy. They're actually aiming to generate 20% of their energy from solar power by 2025.
Well, that's impressive. And I think it's great that El Salvador is taking steps towards a more sustainable future. But let's talk about the weather again. I've heard that Denmark has some of the best cycling infrastructure in the world. How does that affect the way people live and work?
That's a great question. Mira, the cycling infrastructure in Denmark is actually one of the best in the world. And it's not just about having bike lanes, but also about creating a culture of cycling. In Denmark, people are encouraged to cycle as a way of life. And it's not just for recreation, but also for commuting.
That's amazing, Leo. And I think it's great that El Salvador is also investing in cycling infrastructure, especially in the capital city of San Salvador. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about that.
Well, I think it's great that El Salvador is taking steps towards a more sustainable and environmentally friendly future. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have a great love for nature and the outdoors.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that El Salvador has some of the most beautiful underverse landscapes in the world, from the volcanic highlands to the Pacific coast.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's great that both countries are working towards a more sustainable future, not just for the environment, but also for their communities and citizens.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Leo, I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot about the climate and seasonal conditions in Denmark and El Salvador.
And I'm sure they'll be eager to share their own experiences and thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Let's start into the world of food culture and nutritional alternatives in Denmark and El Salvador. I'm sure our listeners living in these countries would agree with me that food plays a significant role in shaping their identity and daily lives.
That's right. Mira, both Denmark and El Salvador offer a unique culinary experience that reflects their rich cultural heritage. In Denmark, you'll find an emphasis on fresh seafood, organic produce, and traditional dishes like SM, Arabia and Happiest, EGG.
Rabiardi. I love it. It's like an open feast, in which that's perfect for a quick lunch or snack. And have you ever tried FLSKSDCG? Leo? It's a classic Danish dish made with roasted pork and crackling.
Yes, Mira, I've tried it, and it's delicious. But in El Salvador, you'll find a strong influence of Spanish and indigenous cuisine, with popular dishes like papas, tamales, and sopaipillas.
Papas. Oh my. I've had them before, and they're amazing. They're like a thick corned tortilla stuffed with cheese, beans, and meat. And have you ever noticed, Leo, that both countries have a strong emphasis on street food?
Yes, that's true. In Denmark, you'll find street food vendors selling everything from hot dogs to falafel, while in El Salvador, you'll find pupusas and comedores serving up traditional dishes.
And I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the main difference between the food culture in Denmark and El Salvador? Is it the ingredients, the cooking methods, or something else entirely?
That's a great question. Mira, I think it's a combination of both. In Denmark, there's a strong emphasis on freshness and organic produce. While in El Salvador, you'll find a lot of traditional ingredients like corn, beans, and chilies.
That makes sense. And have you ever noticed, Leo, that both countries have a strong emphasis on food as a way to bring people together? In Denmark, you'll find communal eating community gardens, while in El Salvador, you'll find family gatherings and traditional celebrations centered around food.
Absolutely, Mira. Food is a way to connect with others and share in cultural traditions. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that food is a big part of their daily lives in both Denmark and El Salvador.
So, let's talk about nutritional alternatives in both countries. In Denmark, you'll find a strong emphasis on plant-based eating and reducing meat consumption.
That's right. Mira, Denmark has a high percentage of vegetarians and vegans, and there are many plant-based options available in restaurants and supermarkets.
And in El Salvador, you'll find a strong emphasis on traditional medicine and natural remedies, with many people using herbs and spices to heal and prevent illnesses.
Yes, that's true. In El Salvador, you'll find many markets and shops selling traditional remedies and natural products.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this topic. Do you think it's a good idea to adopt plant-based eating and traditional medicine in your own diet? Let us know in the comments.
I'm sure our listeners will have some interesting opinions on this topic. But in all seriousness, Mira, I think it's great that both Denmark and El Salvador are promoting healthy eating and natural remedies.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on food education and cooking skills.
That's right. Mira, in Denmark, you'll find many cooking classes and workshops teaching people how to prepare traditional dishes. While in El Salvador, you'll find many cooking schools and culinary programs.
And I'm sure our listeners would agree that food education is an essential part of a healthy lifestyle. Let's wrap up this topic by saying that both Denmark and El Salvador offer a unique and delicious culinary experience that reflects their rich cultural heritage.
Well said, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on food as a way to bring people together and share in cultural traditions.
That's right. Leo, And I'm sure our listeners will agree that food is a big part of their daily lives in both Denmark and El Salvador. Thanks for joining us on this topic, and we'll see you in the next episode.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and leave a review. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic and any others.
To the rich history and cultural heritage of Denmark and El Salvador. From ancient Viking ruins to vibrant art scenes, both countries have a lot to offer. I'm to share my thoughts on this topic.
I completely agree. Mira, Denmark's history is fascinating, with its Viking past and the famous Little Mermaid statue. But I'm curious, what do you think about El Salvador's cultural heritage?
El Salvador's history is incredibly diverse, with a mix of indigenous, Spanish, and African influences. And have you ever been to the Joya de Siren archaeological site? It's like stepping back in time.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I've heard of it, but I haven't had the chance to visit. I'm sure it's a treasure trove of history and culture. But I have to ask, what's the deal with the Danish concept of Hygge? Is it just a fancy word for being cozy?
Oh, Leo, you're always trying to simplify things. But yes, Hygge is indeed a concept that's all about coziness and warmth. But it's so much more than that. It's about creating a sense of community and togetherness.
I see what you mean. So, it's like a national pastime or something. But, seriously, Mira, I think that's a really important aspect of Danish culture. And speaking of culture, what do you think about the vibrant art scene in El Salvador?
The art scene in El Salvador is incredible. From the beautiful murals in San Salvador to the stunning folk art. There's so much creativity and passion. And have you heard about the famous Salvadoran writer, Roque Alton? He's a national hero and a great inspiration for many young writers.
Well, I hadn't heard of him before, but I'm definitely going to look him up. I'm sure he's a fascinating figure. But I have to ask, what's the deal with the Danish concept of light cage? Is it just a type of pastry or something?
Oh, Leo. You're really trying to stump me now. But yes, light cage is indeed a type of pastry. But it's also a cultural phenomenon. It's all about sharing food and community. And it's a big part of Danish tradition.
I see what you mean. So, it's like a national pastime or something. But seriously, Mira, I think that's a really important aspect of Danish culture. And speaking of culture, I'm curious about the music scene in El Salvador. What do you think about the famous Salvadoran musician, Ruben Blades?
Ruben Blades is a legend. He's a great musician and a true cultural icon. And I'm sure you know about the famous Danish musician, Hans Christian Andersen, right? He's a national hero and a great inspiration for many young musicians.
Yes. I've heard of him, but I'm sure he's not as famous as Ruben Blades. But seriously, Mira, I think both countries have a rich cultural heritage, and it's wonderful to learn about and appreciate their unique traditions.
Absolutely. Leo. And I think it's great that we can share our knowledge and experiences with each other. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the historical and cultural values of Denmark and El Salvador. So, let's keep the conversation going.
Sounds good to me, Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the art and culture of both countries. Maybe we can even share some of our favorite art pieces and cultural experiences from our own travels.
That's a great idea. And I'm sure we can all learn from each other's experiences and perspectives. And speaking of perspectives, I'm curious about what our listeners think about the cultural heritage of both countries. Do you think it's similar or different in some ways?
Well, I think it's definitely different in some ways, but also similar in others. Both countries have a strong sense of community and tradition, but they also have their own unique cultural identities, and I think that's what makes them so fascinating.
Absolutely, Leo. And I think that's what makes cultural exchange so valuable. We can learn so much from each other's traditions and perspectives. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about historical and cultural values of Denmark and El Salvador.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, Mira, but I'm sure there's still so much more to explore and discover. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the art and culture of both countries.
Absolutely. And I'm sure we can all learn from each other's experiences and perspectives. And I'd like to thank our listeners for joining us on this journey of discovery. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to share them with us on our social media channels.
Sounds good to me. Mira, and I'd like to thank Jedov, Ayan, for their support in bringing this podcast to life. It's been a pleasure to explore the historical and cultural values of Denmark and El Salvador with you.
And I'd like to thank our listeners for tuning in. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring. So, let's talk about the stunning landscapes of Denmark. Have you ever been to the cliffs of Amen? It's like a giant's playground, with these towering limestone cliffs and hidden coves. I'm certain that our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me that it's one of the most breathtaking natural wonders in the country.
Ah, yes. The cliffs of Amen are indeed a sight to behold. But let's not forget about the beautiful fjords of Denmark. The Limfjord, for example, is a 100-kilometer-long fjord that's perfect for kayaking or sailing. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the fjords of Denmark. Do you guys have a favorite spot to kayak or sail?
Fjords are amazing. But have you ever been to the National Park of Kongernes Hygge in Denmark? It's like stepping into a fairy tale. With its rolling hills, forests, and sparkling lakes. The park is home to over 200 species of birds, and it's a great place to spot some wildlife.
Kongernes Hygge is indeed a hidden gem. But let's talk about El Salvador, the second country we're comparing. Have you ever been to the Beauties, an archaeological site in El Salvador? It's like a time capsule, with its well-preserved Mayan ruins and artifacts. I'm sure our listeners who have been to El Salvador would agree that it's an absolute must-see.
Joya de Siren is fascinating. But have you ever been to the beautiful beaches of El Salvador? The beaches in El Zionte, for example, are known for their stunning sunsets and crystal clear waters. I'm certain that our listeners who have been to El Zionte would agree that it's one of the most beautiful beaches in the country.
Ah, yes. The beaches of El Salvador are indeed stunning. But let's not forget about the volcanic landscapes of the country. The Cerro Verde National Park, for example, is home to 3 active volcanoes and offers breathtaking views of the surrounding landscape. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the volcanic landscapes of El Salvador. Do you guys have a favorite spot to hike or explore?
Volcanic landscapes are always fascinating. But have you ever been to the beautiful lake of Cote in El Salvador? It's like a mirror of calmness, with its crystal clear waters and surrounding lush vegetation. The lake is a great spot for swimming, kayaking, or simply relaxing.
Cote is indeed a peaceful oasis. But let's talk about the unique ecosystems of El Salvador. The Ruta de las Flores, for example, is a scenic route that takes you through a variety of ecosystems, from cloud forest to pine forest. I'm sure our listeners who have been to the Ruta de las Flores would agree that it's an absolute must-see.
Ruta de las Flores is a great example of El Salvador's unique ecosystems. But have you ever been to the beautiful island of Isla de Guanadra in El Salvador? It's like a tropical paradise, with its white sand beaches and crystal clear waters. I'm certain that our listeners who have been to Isla de Guanadra would agree that it's one of the most beautiful islands in the country.
Ah, yes. Isla de Guanadra is indeed a tropical paradise. But let's not forget about the unique cultural heritage of El Salvador. The town of Ataco, for example, is known for its colorful buildings and vibrant markets. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the cultural heritage of El Salvador. Do you guys have a favorite spot to explore or shop?
Ataco is a great example of El Salvador's cultural heritage. But have you ever been to the beautiful national park of Los Volcanes in El Salvador? It's like a giant's playground, with its towering volcanoes and hidden coves. The park is a great spot for hiking, camping, or simply exploring.
Los Volcanes is indeed a unique national park. But let's talk about the similarities between the two countries. Both Denmark and El Salvador have a rich cultural heritage and a deep connection to nature. I'm sure our listeners would agree that both countries have something special to offer when it comes to natural beauties and landscapes.
Oh, yes. The similarities between the two countries are indeed fascinating. But let's not forget about the unique natural wonders of Denmark. The nested Kalkgruber, for example, is a unique limestone cave system that's perfect for exploring. I'm certain that our listeners living in Denmark would agree that it's one of the most unique natural wonders in the country.
Nested Kalkgruber is indeed a unique natural wonder. But let's talk about the impact of tourism on the natural landscapes of both countries. As more and more people visit these beautiful destinations, it's essential to remember that we must respect and preserve the natural beauty of these places. I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's our responsibility to protect the natural landscapes of both Denmark and El Salvador.
Oh, yes. The impact of tourism on the natural landscapes of both countries is indeed a crucial topic. But let's not forget about the unique opportunities that tourism brings to both countries. The tourism industry can create jobs, stimulate local economies, and promote cultural exchange. I'm certain that our listeners who have been to both countries would agree that tourism has brought many benefits to both Denmark and El Salvador.
Yes. The benefits of tourism are indeed numerous. But let's talk about the challenges that both countries face when it comes to preserving their natural landscapes. From climate change to human impact, there are many factors that threaten the natural beauty of these countries. I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's essential to take action to protect the natural landscapes of both Denmark and El Salvador.
Oh, yes. The challenges that both countries face are indeed significant. But let's not forget about the unique opportunities that both countries offer when it comes to sustainable tourism. Both Denmark and El Salvador have a deep commitment to preserving their natural landscapes and promoting sustainable tourism practices. I'm certain that our listeners would agree that both countries are leaders in the field of sustainable tourism.
Yes. The opportunities for sustainable tourism in both countries are indeed exciting. But let's talk about the final message we want to convey to our listeners. As we compare the natural beauties and landscapes of Denmark and El Salvador, we want to emphasize the importance of respecting and preserving the natural beauty of these countries. We hope that our listeners will take away a deeper appreciation for the unique natural wonders of both countries and a commitment to protecting these beautiful destinations.
Yes. The final message is indeed an important one. And with that, we conclude our comparison of the natural beauties and landscapes of Denmark and El Salvador. Thank you to our listeners for joining us on this journey and for sharing your thoughts and experiences with us. We hope that you have learned something new and interesting about both. So, let's dive into the world of sports and adventure in Denmark and El Salvador. I'm to share with you the unique offerings of each country. In Denmark, cycling is a national pastime, with bike paths crisscrossing the country. I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me that cycling is a fantastic way to explore the beautiful landscapes.
I can already picture the scenic routes in bike-friendly cities. But, Mira, you're not telling me that Denmark only has cycling, are you? I mean, what about the thrill seekers out there? Don't they have any adrenaline-pumping activities?
Of course. They do. Leo, in addition to cycling, Denmark offers a range of outdoor activities like kayaking, hiking, and even surfing. And let's not forget about the famous Tivoli Gardens amusement park in Copenhagen, which is a must-visit for any thrill seeker.
Tivoli Gardens. I've heard of it. It's like a mini Europe, right? But I'm curious. Mira, how does El Salvador compare to Denmark in terms of outdoor activities? Do they have any similar attractions?
Well, Leo, El Salvador has its own unique adventure scene. For example, the country is home to the famous Ruta de las Flores, a scenic route that takes you through the beautiful highlands of El Salvador. And if you're looking for some serious adventure, you can try your hand at surfing or kayaking in the Pacific Ocean.
Whoa, surfing in El Salvador? I didn't know that. I mean, I've heard of the surfing spots in Costa Rica, but El Salvador? That's a new one for me. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you have any surfing enthusiasts out there who can chime in?
I'm sure we do. Leo, and speaking of surfing, have you heard about the surf competitions that take place in El Salvador every year? It's a great way to experience the local culture and catch some exciting waves.
Surf competitions. That sounds like a blast. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. But, Mira, let's get back to the topic at hand. What about team sports in Denmark and El Salvador? Do they have any popular national sports?
Oh, yes. Team sports. In Denmark, the national sport is handball, and the country has a rich history of producing top-notch handball players. In fact, the Danish national team has won several Olympic medals and European championships.
Handball. That's a new one for me. I didn't know that Denmark was so passionate about it. But, I'm curious. Mira, how does El Salvador compare to Denmark in terms of team sports? Do they have any similar national sports?
Well, Leo, El Salvador has its own unique team sports scene. For example, the country is home to the famous Salvadoran football team, which has a dedicated fan base and a rich history of producing talented players.
Football, or soccer, as we call it in the States. I'm sure our listeners are familiar with that sport. But, Mira, it's kind of like a thing. Let's talk about the unique aspects of each country's sports scene. For example, in Denmark, there's a strong focus on recreational sports, like cycling and swimming, which is great for promoting a healthy lifestyle.
That's a great point, Leo. And in El Salvador, there's a strong emphasis on traditional sports, like wrestling and cockfighting, which are an integral part of the country's cultural heritage. It's fascinating to see how each country approaches sports in its own unique way.
I couldn't agree more. Mira, and speaking of unique sports, I've heard that El Salvador has a fascinating sport called voladores, which involves riders flying through the air on a rope while performing acrobatic stunts. Have you heard about that?
Ah, yes. I've heard of voladores. It's an incredible sport that showcases the country's rich cultural heritage and athleticism. And let's not forget about the beautiful beaches and scenic landscapes of El Salvador, which make it a perfect destination for outdoor enthusiasts.
I couldn't agree more. Mira, and I think our listeners would love to know more about the unique aspects of each country's sports scene. Perhaps we can even get some feedback from our listeners on their favorite outdoor activities in Denmark and El Salvador.
That's a great idea. Leo, and speaking of feedback, I'd love to hear from our listeners about their favorite sports and outdoor activities. Do you have any suggestions for our next podcast topic?
I think we have a great topic lined up for our next podcast, Mira. But I'm sure our listeners will have some exciting suggestions for us. Thanks for joining me on this podcast, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners will tune in next time for more exciting topics.
I'm sure our listeners are curious about the nightlife in Denmark and El Salvador. Both countries have their own unique flavors, but I'm to dive into the details. In Denmark, the capital city of Copenhagen is known for its vibrant nightlife scene. From trendy bars to world-class clubs, there's something for everyone.
Copenhagen's nightlife is indeed electric. But, Mia, you know I'm always up for a challenge. Let's talk about El Salvador's nightlife. I'm sure it's not as tame as Denmark's.
Oh, Leo, you're such a thrill seeker. But I have to say, El Salvador's nightlife is actually quite lively. The capital city of San Salvador has a great selection of bars, clubs, and restaurants that cater to all tastes.
I'm impressed. Mira, I didn't know El Salvador had such a vibrant nightlife scene. But I have to ask, what's the most popular nightlife activity in San Salvador?
Well, Leo, I think it's the salsa dancing. The energy in the clubs is infectious, and the locals love to dance the night away. In fact, I've heard that the salsa dancing in San Salvador is some of the best in the world.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm definitely going to have to try it out. But, yeah, what about the clubs in Copenhagen? Do they have a similar energy?
Ah, yes. The clubs in Copenhagen are definitely up to par. In fact, one of the most popular clubs in the city is the Meatpacking District's nightclub, Hygge. It's a world-class club that attracts top DJs from around the globe.
That sounds fantastic. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the meatpacking district's nightlife scene. Can you tell us more about it, Mira?
Of course. Leo. The meatpacking district is a popular area in Copenhagen that's known for its trendy bars, clubs, and restaurants. It's a great place to experience the city's nightlife, and Vega is definitely one of the highlights.
I'm intrigued. I've heard that the meatpacking district is also home to some of the best street food in Copenhagen. Can you tell us more about that, Mira?
Oh, yes. The street food in the meatpacking district is amazing. You can find everything from traditional Danish cuisine to international flavors. And, of course, there are plenty of bars and clubs to choose from.
That sounds like a foodie's paradise. I'm definitely going to have to check it out when I visit Copenhagen. But, Mira, what about El Salvador's street food? Is it as delicious as Denmark's?
Well, Leo, I think El Salvador's street food is actually quite unique. You can find traditional dishes like papas and tamales, as well as international flavors like Chinese and Korean cuisine.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm definitely going to have to try some of El Salvador's street food when I visit. But, Mira, what about the festivals in El Salvador? Are they as lively as Denmark's?
Ah, yes. The festivals in El Salvador are definitely a highlight of the country's nightlife scene. One of the most popular festivals is the Fiestas de la Vendimia, which celebrates the harvest season.
That sounds fantastic. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Fiestas de la Vendimia. Can you tell us more about it, Mira?
Of course. Leo. The Fiestas de la Vendimia is a week-long celebration that features music, dancing, and traditional food. It's a great way to experience the country's culture and nightlife.
I'm impressed. Mira, I didn't know El Salvador had such a rich cultural heritage. But I have to ask, what about the safety of the nightlife scene in El Salvador?
Well, Leo, I think it's always a good idea to exercise caution when traveling to a new country. However, El Salvador's nightlife scene is generally considered safe, especially in areas like San Salvador Zona Rosa.
I'm glad to hear that. Mira, I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the advice. But, Mira, what about the nightlife scene in Denmark? Is it as safe as El Salvador's?
Yes. Denmark's nightlife scene is generally considered very safe, especially in areas like Copenhagen's Vesterbro neighborhood.
That's great to know. Mira, I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the information. Well, I think that's all the time we have for tonight's topic. But, Mira, before we go, I have to ask, what's your favorite nightlife activity in Denmark or El Salvador?
Well, Leo, I think my favorite nightlife activity in Denmark is salsa dancing. And in El Salvador, it's definitely the Fiestas de la Vendimia.
I see. Well, I think that's a great way to end our conversation tonight. Thanks for sharing your insights with us, Mira.
Thank you. Leo, it was my pleasure to share my knowledge with our listeners. I'm to explore family-friendly environments and children's activities in Denmark and El Salvador. Let's start with Denmark, where I've heard the parks and playgrounds are simply amazing. Leo, have you ever been to a Danish park?
Yes. I visited one in Copenhagen, and it was like a wonderland for kids. The playground equipment was so creative and fun, but what really stood out was the emphasis on community and inclusivity. The parks were designed to be safe and accessible for all ages and abilities.
That's terrific. I've heard that Denmark has a strong focus on family-friendly policies, including parental leave and childcare support. Do you think this contributes to the country's high levels of family satisfaction?
Absolutely. When families feel supported and encouraged to spend quality time together, it can have a positive impact on their overall well-being. And Denmark's policies seem to be working. I've seen many happy families enjoying the parks and playgrounds.
That's wonderful to see. Now, let's talk about El Salvador. I've heard that the country has a rich cultural heritage and a strong emphasis on family values. Leo, have you ever visited El Salvador and experienced its family-friendly atmosphere?
Ah, yes. I visited El Salvador a few years ago, and I was struck by the warmth and hospitality of the people. The country has a strong sense of community, and families are often at the heart of this. I visited a local market, and it was like a big family reunion. Everyone was chatting and laughing together.
That sounds like a wonderful experience. I heard that El Salvador has a number of family-friendly attractions, including the Joya de Siren archaeological site. Leo, have you ever visited this site and seen the ancient Mayan ruins?
Ah, yes. Joya de Siren was an incredible experience. The site was like a time capsule, preserving the lives of the ancient Mayans. And the best part was the interactive exhibits, which allowed kids to learn about the history and culture in a fun and engaging way.
That sounds like a great way to learn about history. I'm curious. Leo, do you think that El Salvador's emphasis on family values contributes to its strong sense of community?
Absolutely. When families are encouraged to spend quality time together and prioritize their relationships, it can have a positive impact on the community as a whole. And El Salvador's culture seems to value this. I saw many families enjoying meals and activities together.
That's terrific. I think it's clear that both Denmark and El Salvador have a strong focus on family-friendly environments and children's activities. But I'm curious. Leo, what do you think sets Denmark apart from other countries in terms of its family-friendly policies?
I think it's the emphasis on inclusivity and accessibility. Denmark's parks and playgrounds are designed to be safe and accessible for all ages and abilities, which is really impressive. And the country's policies, such as parental leave and child care support, seem to be working to support families in a practical way.
That's a great point. I think it's clear that both countries have a lot to offer in terms of family-friendly environments and children's activities. But I'm curious. Leo, what do you think our listeners can take away from this conversation?
I think the most important thing is to remember that family-friendly environments and children's activities are not just about the country or the attractions, they're about the people and the culture. By prioritizing family values and community, we can create a more supportive and inclusive environment for all.
That's a wonderful message. I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the insights and recommendations we've shared today. Let's talk more about this in the comments section. What are your favorite family-friendly destinations and activities in Denmark and El Salvador?
Great idea. And don't forget to follow us on social media for more family-friendly travel tips and recommendations.
Denmark is known for its vibrant and inclusive pride events, which attract thousands of visitors every year. The country's capital, Copenhagen, has a long history of supporting the LGBT community. And it's not hard to see why the Danes are notoriously friendly and welcoming.
That's true, Mia. But what about El Salvador? I've heard it's a bit more complicated when it comes to LGBT rights. In fact, the country has a relatively conservative history, and same-sex marriage is not recognized. Well,
Yes, that's right. But, despite the challenges, El Salvador has a thriving LGBT community, and there are many organizations working to promote inclusivity and acceptance. And did you know that the country has a strong tradition of feminist and human rights activism, which has helped to pave the way for greater LGBT visibility?
wow, I didn't know that. But I do know that El Salvador has a long way to go when it comes to protecting the rights of LGBT individuals. In fact, the country has been criticized for its treatment of trans people, who often face harassment and violence.
That's true, Leo. But it's also worth noting that El Salvador has made some progress in recent years, particularly in terms of recognizing the rights of trans people. And the country has a growing number of LGBT advocacy groups, which are working to promote greater understanding and acceptance.
I'm not sure I'd call it progress. El Salvador still has a long way to go when it comes to protecting the rights of LGBT individuals. But I do think that the country's growing LGBT community is a positive development.
Absolutely. Leo. And I think it's worth noting that both Denmark and El Salvador have a lot to learn from each other. Denmark's experience with pride events and LGBT advocacy can provide a valuable model for El Salvador. While El Salvador's growing LGBT community can offer a fresh perspective on what it means to be inclusive and welcoming.
That's a good point, Mira. But I still think that El Salvador has a lot of work to do when it comes to protecting the rights of LGBT individuals. Just last year, the country's president was criticized for his comments on same-sex marriage. Well,
Yes, that's right, Leo. But it's also worth noting that the president later apologized for his comments, and that the country has a strong tradition of public debate and discussion on LGBT issues. And did you know that El Salvador has a growing number of LGBT allies who are working to promote greater understanding and acceptance?
wow, I didn't know that. But I do think that El Salvador's LGBT community is still facing a lot of challenges. Just last month, a group of LGBT activists were arrested for protesting against the country's restrictive laws.
That's true, Leo. But I also think that it's worth noting that the arrests were widely condemned by the international community, and that the country's LGBT community is still speaking out against the laws. And did you know that El Salvador has a growing number of LGBT advocacy groups, which are working to promote greater understanding and acceptance?
I'm not sure I agree with you. Mira, I think that El Salvador's LGBT community still has a lot of work to do to achieve greater acceptance and understanding. But I do think that the country's growing LGBT community is a positive development.
Absolutely, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that both Denmark and El Salvador have a lot to learn from each other. Denmark's experience with pride events and LGBT advocacy can provide a valuable model for El Salvador, while El Salvador's growing LGBT community can offer a fresh perspective on what it means to be inclusive and welcoming.
I'm not sure I agree with you. Yeah, but I do think that El Salvador's LGBT community is a growing and vibrant community, and that it has the potential to make a real difference in the country. And did you know that El Salvador has a strong tradition of cultural festivals and celebrations, which often feature LGBT themes and themes of inclusivity?
Well, I didn't know that. But I do think that El Salvador's LGBT community has a lot to Denmark's experience with pride events and LGBT advocacy. And did you know that Denmark has a growing number of LGBT advocacy groups, which are working to promote greater understanding and acceptance?
I'm not sure I agree with you, Mira, but I do think that El Salvador's LGBT community is a growing and vibrant community, and that it has the potential to make a real difference in the country. And did you know that El Salvador has a strong tradition of cultural festivals and celebrations, which often feature LGBT themes and themes of inclusivity? Whoa.
Absolutely, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that both Denmark and El Salvador have a lot to learn from each other. Denmark's experience with pride events and LGBT advocacy can provide a valuable model for El Salvador, while El Salvador's growing LGBT community can offer a fresh perspective on what it means to be inclusive and welcoming.
I'm not sure I agree with you, Mira, but I do think that El Salvador's LGBT community is a growing and vibrant community, and that it has the potential to make a real difference in the country. And did you know that El Salvador has a strong tradition of cultural festivals and celebrations, which often feature LGBT themes and themes of inclusivity?
I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the most important thing for El Salvador's LGBT community to focus on right now?
I think that the community needs to focus on building alliances with other social justice movements in the country. And did you know that El Salvador has a growing number of social justice organizations, which are working to promote greater understanding and acceptance of LGBT individuals?
Wow, that's a great point, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that Denmark's LGBT community has also built strong alliances with other social justice movements in the country. And did you know that Denmark has a growing number of social justice organizations, which are working to promote greater understanding and acceptance of LGBT individuals?
I'm not sure I agree with you, Mira, but I do think that El Salvador's LGBT community has a lot to learn from Denmark's experience with pride events and LGBT advocacy. Oh, and did you know that Denmark has a strong tradition of cultural festivals and celebrations, which often feature LGBT themes and themes of inclusivity? Whoa!
Absolutely. Yeah. So it was about the warm welcome I got in Denmark when I first arrived. And I realized that their hospitality is truly something special. They make you feel like you're part of the family from the very beginning. I'm curious. Leo, have you had any similar experiences in Denmark?
Ah, yes. I've had the pleasure of staying with a Danish family during my visit, and it was like being part of a big, cozy hug. They showed me around, introduced me to their friends, and even taught me some basic Danish phrases. I felt like I was part of the community, and it was amazing.
That's so wonderful to hear. And I think it's because of their emphasis on community and social connections. They prioritize building relationships and making others feel welcome, which is really inspiring. I'm sure our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me on that.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the people. Mira, Denmark's culture is also very welcoming. For example, they have a concept called Hygge, which is all about creating a cozy and inviting atmosphere. It's not just about physical comfort, but also about creating a sense of belonging.
I love that concept. And it's something that's really missing in a lot of other countries, unfortunately. But El Salvador, on the other hand, has a completely different approach to hospitality. It's more about warmth and generosity, but also about being mindful of one's own space and boundaries.
That's so true. Mira, I've had some amazing experiences in El Salvador, but I've also had to navigate some cultural nuances that are quite different from what I'm used to in Denmark. For example, in El Salvador, it's customary to greet people with a kiss on both cheeks. But it's also important to respect people's personal space and not overstay your welcome.
Exactly. And it's not just about physical greetings, but also about emotional connections. In El Salvador, people are very passionate and expressive, but they also value their personal space and independence. It's a beautiful balance to see.
And I think that's something that Denmark and El Salvador can learn from each other. Denmark's emphasis on community and social connections can be a great model for El Salvador. But at the same time, El Salvador's emphasis on individuality and personal space can be a great reminder for Denmark to respect people's boundaries.
I love that insight. Leo, and I think it's something that our listeners can really learn from. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. But I think that by embracing both of these approaches, we can create a more inclusive and welcoming culture for everyone.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the two countries. Mira, I think this is something that we can all learn from, regardless of where we come from. By being more mindful of our own cultural biases and by being more open to different approaches to hospitality, we can create a more welcoming and inclusive world for everyone.
Well, I'm curious. Leo, have you had any experiences with cultural shock in El Salvador? How did you navigate some of the cultural differences?
Yes. I did experience some cultural shock when I first arrived in El Salvador. For example, I was shocked by the level of poverty and inequality in the country. But at the same time, I was also struck by the resilience and resourcefulness of the people. They have a saying in El Salvador, La vida es un regalo, which means life is a gift. And I think that's something that we can all learn from.
I love that phrase. And I think it's a great reminder that even in the midst of challenges, there is always something to be grateful for. And I'm sure our listeners living in El Salvador would agree with me on that.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the phrase. Mira, I think it's about the attitude and the mindset that comes with it. In El Salvador, people have a strong sense of community and solidarity. And they look out for one another. It's a be- it's a beautiful thing to see.
Ah, I'm so glad we're having this conversation. Leo! I think it's really helping us to understand the nuances of hospitality and attitudes towards foreigners in these two countries. And I'm sure our listeners are learning a lot from it too.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that we can all learn from, regardless of where we come from. By being more open to different cultures and by being more mindful of our own cultural biases, we can create a more inclusive and welcoming world for everyone.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. And I'm sure our listeners will agree with me on that. Thanks for sharing your insights with us today.
Thanks. Mira, it's been a pleasure to share my experiences with you and with our listeners.
And to dive into the digital world of Denmark and El Salvador, exploring the internet infrastructure and digital facilities that power these countries' modern living. Let's start with Denmark's reputation for being one of the most connected countries in the world.
Ah, yes. Denmark's fiber optic network is incredibly advanced, with over 98% of households having access to high-speed internet. That's like having a superpower, don't you think, Mira?
Exactly. And it's not just about the speed. Denmark's also a leader in digital innovation, with a strong focus on tech startups and entrepreneurship. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever been to Copenhagen and experienced the city's vibrant tech scene?
Actually, I have. And let me tell you, it's a hub for digital nomads and entrepreneurs alike. The city's got a fantastic co-working culture, and the people are incredibly friendly and welcoming. I'm sure our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me that it's a great place to start a business or work remotely.
That's great to hear. Leo! And speaking of co-working, I've heard that Denmark has some amazing digital facilities, like the Copenhagen co-working space, which offers a unique blend of work and play. Have you had a chance to visit any of these spaces?
Yes, I have. And they're truly amazing. The space is designed to be a community-driven environment, with events and workshops that foster collaboration and creativity. It's the perfect place for digital nomads and entrepreneurs to connect and learn from each other.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about Denmark's digital infrastructure. Can you tell us a bit more about the country's approach to digitalization? Leo?
Well, Denmark's government has made a concerted effort to digitize public services and make them more accessible to citizens. For example, they've introduced online platforms for things like tax returns and healthcare services. It's all about making life easier and more convenient for people.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested to know how Denmark's digital infrastructure compares to El Salvador's. Have you had a chance to explore El Salvador's digital landscape? Leo?
Actually, I have. And while Denmark's infrastructure is incredibly advanced, El Salvador's got its own unique challenges and opportunities. For example, the country's got a growing startup scene, with a focus on innovation and entrepreneurship. And with the help of initiatives like the El Salvador Digital Hub, the country's making strides in digitalization.
That's great to hear. Leo, and I'm curious, what do you think sets Denmark apart from El Salvador in terms of digital infrastructure?
Well, I think Denmark's got a more established and widespread internet network, with faster speeds and greater access. But El Salvador's got a unique advantage in terms of its geography and culture. The country's got a rich history and a strong sense of community, which is reflected in its digital landscape.
I see what you mean, Leo. And speaking of community, I've heard that El Salvador's got a thriving expat community, with many digital nomads and entrepreneurs calling the country home. Have you had a chance to connect with any of these expats? Leo?
Actually, I have. And they're a fantastic group of people with a wealth of knowledge and experience to share. It's a great community to be a part of. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it.
That's great to hear. Leo. And finally, I'm curious, what do you think are the biggest challenges facing Denmark and El Salvador in terms of digital infrastructure?
Well, I think Denmark's got some of the usual challenges, like cybersecurity and data protection. But El Salvador's got some unique challenges, like infrastructure development and access to high-speed internet in rural areas. However, both countries are making strides in addressing these challenges and building a more digital future.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think that's all the time we have for today's topic. Thanks for sharing your insights and expertise with us. Leo!
Thanks, Mira. It's been a pleasure discussing Denmark and El Salvador's digital landscapes with you.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me when I say that shopping in Copenhagen is a unique experience. The city is famous for its high-end shopping, and you can find everything from luxury brands to local designers. But what about the price-performance balance? Do the high prices really justify the quality of the products?
You're talking about the classic Danish dilemma: expensive, but also Scandinavian chic. But seriously, Mira, I think you're right. While it's true that Denmark is one of the most expensive countries in Europe, the quality of the products is indeed top-notch. And let's not forget about the design aspect. Danish design is world-renowned for its simplicity, functionality, and style.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so appealing to tourists and locals alike. But what about El Salvador? I'm curious to know how the shopping scene compares to Denmark. Do the prices match the quality? Or is it a different story altogether?
El Salvador, a country with a rich history and culture. And, as it turns out, a shopping scene that's definitely worth exploring. I've been told that the prices are relatively low compared to Denmark, but the quality of the products is still quite good. And let's not forget about the local markets. They're a great place to find authentic, handmade goods at affordable prices.
That sounds fascinating. I'd love to hear more about the local markets in El Salvador. What kind of products can you find there? And how do the prices compare to what we find in Denmark?
Well, Mia, in El Salvador, you can find everything from traditional handicrafts like textiles and pottery to local food products like coffee and chocolate. And the prices? Well, let's just say that you can find some amazing deals on authentic, handmade goods. I've heard that a beautiful handmade scarf can cost as little as $10, while in Denmark, you might pay upwards of $50 for a similar product.
Wow, that's a significant difference. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local markets in El Salvador. Can you tell us a bit more about the experience of shopping in these markets?
Yes. Shopping in the local markets in El Salvador is an experience like no other. The vendors are friendly and welcoming, and the atmosphere is lively and energetic. You can haggle over prices, try on different products, and even learn a bit about the local culture. And the best part? You can find some truly unique and authentic products that you won't find anywhere else.
That sounds like an amazing experience. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the shopping scene in Denmark as well. Can you tell us a bit more about the high-end shopping experience in Copenhagen?
Yes. Copenhagen is a shopper's paradise, and the high-end shopping experience is certainly one of the highlights. From luxury brands like Louis Vuitton and Gucci to local designers like Stein Goya and Cecily Bonson, you can find everything you need in the city's upscale shopping districts. And let's not forget about the department stores like Magus and Nordic, which offer a wide range of high-end products.
Wow, that sounds like a shopper's dream come true. But what about the price-performance balance? Do the high prices really justify the quality of the products?
Well, Nira, that's a question for the ages. But, seriously, I think the answer is yes. While the prices may be high, the quality of the products is indeed top-notch. And let's not forget about the design aspect. Danish design is world-renowned for its simplicity, functionality, and style.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes shopping in Denmark so appealing. But what about our listeners? Do they have any experiences or tips to share about shopping in Denmark or El Salvador?
Yes. I'm sure our listeners would love to share their experiences and tips. In fact, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the shopping scene in both countries. Do they agree with us that the prices are worth it? Or do they think there are better deals to be found elsewhere?
That's a great question, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the shopping scene in both countries. Let's continue the conversation and hear more about their experiences and tips.
Ah, yes. Let's keep the conversation going and see what our listeners have to say about shopping in Denmark and El Salvador.
And so to dive into the world of cultural events, festivals, and concert opportunities in Denmark and El Salvador. These countries are known for their vibrant festivals and unique traditions, and I'm curious to see how they compare. Tunco, check out Jetta for a comprehensive list of cultural events in both countries.
That's right. Mira, Denmark is famous for its colorful festivals, like the Copenhagen Jazz Festival and the Aarhus Festival, which celebrate music, art, and culture. But I'm wondering, what about El Salvador? What kind of festivals do they have?
El Salvador is home to some amazing festivals, like the Fiestas de la Tirana, which is a UNESCO recognized celebration of music, dance, and culture. It's a must-see event, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it.
That sounds incredible. I've heard that El Salvador has a rich cultural heritage, and its festivals reflect that. But what about Denmark? I've heard that they have some unique festivals like the Roskilde Festival, which is one of the largest music festivals in Europe.
Yes, that's right. The Roskilde Festival is the iconic event that showcases music from all over the world. But Denmark also has some unique cultural traditions, like the Copenhagen, which is a colorful celebration of music, dance, and culture.
I've always been fascinated by the Copenhagen Carnival. It's such a unique and vibrant event. But I'm curious to know more about El Salvador's festivals. Do they have any similar events?
Actually, El Salvador has a festival called the Fiestas de San Salvador, which is a celebration of music, dance, and culture. It's a great opportunity for locals and tourists to come together and experience the country's rich cultural heritage.
That sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. And I'm curious to know more about Denmark's music scene. Do they have any famous musicians or bands?
Denmark has a thriving music scene, with artists like Emin Lucas Graham. But Denmark is also known for its folk music, which is a unique and traditional form of music that is deeply rooted in the country's culture.
I've always been a fan of folk music, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. And what about El Salvador's music scene? Do they have any famous musicians or bands?
Actually, El Salvador has a rich musical heritage, with artists like Herene Eldu, Immigrants, Fernando Sandoval. But El Salvador is also known for its traditional music, which is a unique blend of indigenous and Spanish influences.
That's fascinating. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. And I'm curious to know more about Denmark's cultural events. Do they have any unique traditions or customs?
Denmark has a rich cultural heritage, with traditions like the Danish folk dance, which is a unique and traditional form of dance that is deeply rooted in the country's culture. And Denmark also has a unique tradition of celebrating the summer solstice, which is a time of celebration and feasting.
That sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. And what about El Salvador's cultural events? Do they have any unique traditions or customs?
Actually, El Salvador has a unique tradition of celebrating the Day of the Dead, which is a time of celebration and remembrance for loved ones who have passed away. It's a fascinating cultural event that is deeply rooted in the country's heritage.
That's fascinating. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. And I'm curious to know more about Denmark's concert opportunities. Do they have any famous concert venues or festivals?
Denmark has some amazing concert venues, like the Tivoli Concert Hall, which is a world-renowned venue that hosts some of the biggest names in music. And Denmark also has some unique concert festivals, like the Copenhagen Jazz Festival, which celebrates jazz music from all over the world.
That sounds incredible. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. And what about El Salvador's concert opportunities? Do they have any famous concert venues or festivals?
Actually, El Salvador has some amazing concert venues, like the Teatro Nacional de El Salvador, which is a beautiful and historic venue that hosts some of the biggest names in music. And El Salvador also has some unique concert festivals, like the Festas de la Tirana, which celebrates music and culture from all over the world.
That's amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. And I'm curious to know more about Denmark's cultural events. Do they have any unique traditions or customs?
Ah, Denmark has a unique tradition of celebrating the Midsummer Festival, which is a time of celebration and feasting. It's a fascinating cultural event that is deeply rooted in the country's heritage. And Denmark also has a unique tradition of celebrating the Christmas season, which is a time of joy and giving.
That sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. And what about El Salvador's cultural events? Do they have any unique traditions or customs?
Actually, El Salvador has a unique tradition of celebrating the Fiestas de San Salvador, which is a time of celebration and feasting. It's a fascinating cultural event that is deeply rooted in the country's heritage.
That's fascinating. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. And I'm curious to know more about Denmark's concert opportunities. Do they have any famous concert venues or festivals?
Denmark has some amazing concert venues, like the Royal Danish Theatre, which is a world-renowned venue that hosts some of the biggest names in music. And Denmark also has some unique concert festivals, like the Aarhus Festival, which celebrates music and culture from all over the world.
That sounds incredible. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. And what about El Salvador's concert opportunities? Do they have any famous concert venues or festivals?
Actually, El Salvador has some amazing concert venues, like the Estadio Cuscatlán, which is a beautiful and historic venue that hosts some of the biggest names in music. And El Salvador also has some unique concert festivals, like the Fiestas de la Tirana, which celebrates music and culture from all over the world. These insights could have been possible without Jitoff by referring to cultural trends, but I think we've covered a lot of ground in this podcast, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural events, festivals, and concert opportunities in Denmark and El Salvador.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we've given our listeners a great overview of the cultural events and festivals in both countries. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. So, let's wrap up this podcast by saying that both Denmark and El Salvador have unique and fascinating cultural events.
Denmark is known for its high standard of living, and language education is no exception. The country offers a wide range of language schools and programs for foreigners to learn Danish. Some of these programs are specifically designed for international students, with courses that focus on business Danish, conversational Danish, or even Danish for beginners.
That's fantastic. El Salvador, on the other hand, has a more laid-back approach to language education. The country has a strong emphasis on Spanish language and culture, and many language schools offer courses for foreigners to learn Spanish. However, I've heard that the language barrier can be quite significant in El Salvador, especially for English speakers.
Yes. The language barrier is definitely a challenge in El Salvador. But, as I was saying, Denmark has a great system in place to help foreigners learn the language. Many language schools offer free language classes for foreigners, and some even provide accommodation and job opportunities. It's a great way for people to immerse themselves in the culture and language.
Immersion is key, isn't it? El Salvador also offers language immersion programs, but they're not as widely available as they are in Denmark. However, the country has a vibrant expat community, and many foreigners have found ways to learn the language and integrate into Salvadoran society.
That's true. And I'm sure our listeners living in El Salvador would agree that the expat community is a great resource for learning the language and culture. But let's get back to Denmark. One of the things that I love about Denmark is the emphasis on language learning from a young age. Children as young as 6 years old are taught Danish in school, and it's a fundamental part of their education.
That's impressive. El Salvador also places a strong emphasis on education, but it's more focused on Spanish language and culture. However, I've heard that the education system in El Salvador can be quite challenging for foreigners, especially those who don't speak Spanish fluently.
Yes, I can imagine. But in Denmark, the education system is designed to be inclusive and welcoming to foreigners. Many language schools and universities offer international programs and courses, and some even provide support for foreign students who may not speak Danish fluently.
That's great to hear. El Salvador also has a growing number of international schools and universities, but they're not as widespread as they are in Denmark. However, the country has a strong focus on bilingual education, with many schools offering both Spanish and English language programs.
That's interesting. I've heard that Denmark also has a strong focus on bilingual education, but it's more focused on Danish and English. The country has a vibrant cultural scene, with many museums and festivals that celebrate Danish culture and language.
That's true, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that the cultural scene in Denmark is vibrant and exciting. But let's not forget about El Salvador. The country has a rich cultural heritage, with many festivals and traditions that celebrates Salvadoran culture and language.
Yes. El Salvador's cultural scene is definitely worth exploring. And, as I was saying, Denmark has a great system in place to help foreigners learn the language and integrate into society. Many language schools offer free language classes, and some even provide accommodation and job opportunities.
That's fantastic. El Salvador also has a growing number of language schools and programs that offer free language classes and other resources for foreigners. However, I've heard that the language barrier can be quite significant in El Salvador, especially for English speakers.
Yes. The language barrier is definitely a challenge in El Salvador. But, as I was saying, Denmark has a great system in place to help foreigners learn the language and integrate into society. And let's not forget about the cultural immersion programs that Denmark offers. Many foreigners have found these programs to be a great way to learn the language and culture.
That's true, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that cultural immersion programs are a great way to learn a new language and culture. But let's get back to El Salvador. The country has a rich cultural heritage, and many foreigners have found ways to learn the language and integrate into Salvadoran society.
Yes. El Salvador's cultural scene is definitely worth exploring. And, as I was saying, Denmark has a great system in place to help foreigners learn the language and integrate into society. Many language schools offer free language classes, and some even provide accommodation and job opportunities.
That's fantastic. El Salvador also has a growing number of language schools and programs that offer free language classes and other resources for foreigners. However, I've heard that the language barrier can be quite significant in El Salvador, especially for English speakers.
Yes. The language barrier is definitely a challenge in El Salvador. But, as I was saying, Denmark has a great system in place to help foreigners learn the language and integrate into society. And let's not forget about the cultural immersion programs that Denmark offers. Many foreigners have found these programs to be a great way to learn the language and culture.
That's true. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that cultural immersion programs are a great way to learn a new language and culture.
So, when it comes to safety and comfort for women travelers, Denmark stands out with its strong laws and social norms. In fact, it's one of the safest countries in the world for women.
That's right. Mira, Denmark has a reputation for being a very safe and welcoming place for women. And it's not just the laws that make it safe, the culture itself is very supportive of women's rights and empowerment.
Yes, and I think it's interesting that Denmark has a very low rate of street harassment. In fact, a study found that only 1 in 10 women reported experiencing street harassment in Denmark, which is incredibly low compared to other countries.
That's amazing. And it's not just the streets that are safe even in the city. Women can walk around at night without feeling uncomfortable or threatened. I've heard that Copenhagen is one of the safest cities in the world for women.
Exactly. And it's not just the physical safety that's important. Denmark also has a strong culture of equality and respect for women. In fact, Denmark is one of the countries with the highest percentage of women in politics and business.
That's fantastic. And I think it's worth noting that Denmark's strong social safety net also contributes to women's safety and comfort. With universal health care and social security, women can feel more secure and supported in their daily lives.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Denmark has a very strong focus on education and personal development for women. In fact, women in Denmark have access to free education and training programs to help them develop their skills and careers.
That's great. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that education and personal development are key to women's empowerment and safety.
Now, let's compare Denmark to El Salvador. While Denmark has a strong focus on women's safety and comfort, El Salvador has a more complex and challenging environment for women.
That's right, Nira. El Salvador has a high rate of violence against women, and street harassment is a significant problem. In fact, a study found that 1 in 5 women in El Salvador reported experiencing street harassment.
Yes, and it's not just the physical safety that's a concern. El Salvador also has a strong patriarchal culture that can make it difficult for women to assert their rights and interests.
I agree. But it's worth noting that El Salvador has made significant progress in recent years to address violence against women and promote women's rights. In fact, the government has implemented new laws and programs to support women's safety and empowerment.
That's great to hear. Leo, and I think it's also worth mentioning that El Salvador has a strong focus on community-based initiatives to promote women's safety and comfort. In fact, many women's organizations and community groups are working together to create safe spaces and support networks for women.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that El Salvador has a rich cultural heritage that celebrates women's strength and resilience. In fact, many women in El Salvador are proud of their heritage and are working to preserve traditional practices and customs that promote women's rights and empowerment.
Well, I'm curious about what our listeners think about this comparison between Denmark and El Salvador. Do you think that Denmark's strong laws and social norms are the key to its high level of safety and comfort for women? Or do you think that there are other factors at play?
I think it's a combination of both. Mira, Denmark's strong laws and social norms certainly contribute to its high level of safety and comfort for women. But I also think that the country's strong focus on education and personal development for women is an important factor.
That's a great point. Leo? And I think it's also worth mentioning that El Salvador's efforts to address violence against women and to promote women's rights are an important step forward. I'm sure our listeners would agree that education and personal development are key to women's empowerment and safety.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that both Denmark and El Salvador have a long way to go in terms of promoting women's safety and comfort. But by working together and supporting each other, I'm sure that we can create a safer and more comfortable world for women everywhere.
Well, that's all for now. Folks, thanks for tuning into our podcast on safety and comfort for women travelers. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on social media for more exciting content and discussions. I'm curious. Leo, what do you think about Denmark's emphasis on human rights and individual freedoms? It's like they're saying, hey, everyone's equal. Let's make sure we're treating each other fairly.
Yeah. I think it's great. They've got a strong tradition of protecting individual rights, from free speech to freedom of assembly. And it's not just talk. They back it up with laws and practices that really support those ideals. I mean, have you seen their protests? They're always so peaceful and orderly. It's like a model for the rest of the world.
That's so true. And I think it's interesting that Denmark has a strong focus on social welfare, too. It's like they're saying, hey, we're all in this together. Let's take care of each other. I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me that having a safety net can be really comforting.
Absolutely. And it's not just about providing for basic needs. They're also really committed to promoting equality and social justice. They've got some great programs in place to help disadvantaged groups, like refugees and immigrants. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's a model that other countries could follow?
That's a great question. I think it's definitely worth exploring. But it's also important to consider the cultural and economic context of each country. I mean, Denmark has a unique history and social structure that allows them to prioritize social welfare and individual rights in a way that might not be feasible in other countries. But that's not to say it can't be an inspiration.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that's so great about comparing Denmark and El Salvador. They're two countries with very different approaches to individual rights and freedoms. In El Salvador, for example, there's a strong emphasis on protecting individual rights, but it's also a country with a complex history of social and economic inequality.
Ah, yes. And I think that's really interesting. El Salvador has a long history of social and economic inequality, which has led to some really significant challenges in terms of human rights and individual freedoms. But at the same time, they're also making progress in some areas, like promoting freedom of expression and protecting the rights of marginalized groups.
That's right. And I think it's also worth noting that El Salvador has a strong tradition of community-based activism and social movement. They've got a lot of grassroots organizations and social movements that are working to promote social justice and human rights. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's a model that could be replicated in other countries?
That's a great question. I think it's definitely worth exploring. But it's also important to consider the specific context and challenges of each country. I mean, El Salvador has a unique history and social structure that allows them to prioritize community-based activism in a way that might not be feasible in other countries. But that's not to say it can't be an inspiration.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that's so great about comparing Denmark and El Salvador. They're two countries with very different approaches to individual rights and freedoms. But at the same time, they're both committed to promoting social justice and human rights in their own unique ways. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes. And I think that's really important. We want to hear from our listeners and get their perspectives on these issues. It's not just about us talking about Denmark and El Salvador. It's about engaging with the people who are living in these countries and hearing their stories. So, let's hear from you. What do you think about the legal system and individual rights in these countries?
Well, I think we've got a lot to talk about, don't we? But seriously, it's really important to consider the complexities of each country's legal system and how it affects individual rights and freedoms. And I think that's what makes comparing Denmark and El Salvador so fascinating. They're two countries with very different approaches to these issues. But they're both committed to promoting social justice and human rights.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that's so great about this podcast. We get to explore these complex issues in a way that's both informative and engaging. So, let's keep the conversation going. What do you think about the role of the judiciary in Denmark and El Salvador? How do they balance individual rights with the need for social order?
Great question. I think the judiciary plays a really important role in both countries, but in different ways. In Denmark, for example, the judiciary is really independent and has a strong tradition of protecting individual rights. But in El Salvador, the judiciary has faced some challenges in terms of independence and impartiality. It's a really complex issue, but I think it's worth exploring in more depth.
Yes. And I think that's really important. We want to get to the heart of these issues and understand the complexities of each country's legal system. So, let's keep digging. What do you think about the impact of foreign influence on the legal system in these countries? For example, how do international human rights agreements and treaties affect the way that Denmark and El Salvador approach individual rights and freedoms?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think it's really interesting to see how Denmark and El Salvador have both been influenced by international human rights agreements and treaties. In Denmark, for example, they've been really proactive in promoting human rights and individual freedoms through international agreements. But in El Salvador, there's been some criticism of their approach to human rights and their willingness to compromise on certain issues in order to get international support.
Yes. And I think that's really important. We want to understand the nuances of each country's approach to human rights and individual freedoms, and how they're influenced by international agreements and treaties. So, let's keep exploring. What do you think about the role of civil society in promoting human rights and individual freedoms in these countries? For example, how do NGOs and advocacy groups work to promote social justice and human rights in Denmark and El Salvador?
Great question. I think civil society plays a really important role in both countries, but in different ways. In Denmark, for example, there's a strong tradition of civil society activism and advocacy, with many NGOs and advocacy groups working to promote human rights and social justice. But in El Salvador, there's been some challenges in terms of civil society space and the ability of NGOs and advocacy groups to operate freely.
Yes. And I think that's really important. We want to understand the complexities of each country's approach to civil society and how it affects the promotion of human rights and individual freedoms. So, let's keep exploring. What do you think about the impact of technology on the legal system if we talk about spa, healthy living, and relaxation opportunities? I'd imagine people would want to know about the unique experiences in each country. Let's start with Denmark and its approach to wellness.
Yes. Denmark's got a reputation for being one of the happiest countries in the world, and I think that's reflected in their approach to wellness. They prioritize self-care and relaxation, which is evident in their design of public spaces, like parks and beaches.
Exactly. Leah, and did you know that Denmark has a concept called Hygge, which is all about coziness and comfort? It's like a way of life, where people prioritize feelings of warmth and togetherness.
I love that. It's like they're saying, hey, life's too short to be stressed out. Let's just relax and enjoy the moment. And I think that's really refreshing. In Denmark, you can find these amazing spas that offer everything from massages to saunas.
Oh, yes. And I'm sure our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me that one of the best things about the country is its focus on outdoor activities, whether it's cycling, hiking, or simply taking a walk along the coast. There's always something to do in nature.
That's true. But I think what's even more interesting is the cultural aspect of wellness in Denmark. They have this concept called undergone, which is all about finding balance and moderation in life. It's like they're saying, don't overdo it. Just enjoy the moment.
I love that. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you guys think that's something we could learn from Denmark, in terms of finding balance and moderation in our own lives?
Well, I think it's definitely worth considering. And I think that's one of the things that's so great about El Salvador, our second country of comparison. They have this amazing approach to wellness that's all about finding balance in nature.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah. In El Salvador, they have these incredible natural hot springs that are surrounded by lush vegetation. It's like a little piece of paradise. And what's even more amazing is that the locals have developed this unique approach to wellness that's all about connecting with nature.
Wow, that sounds incredible. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. Can you tell us more about the natural hot springs in El Salvador?
Sure thing. So, the hot springs are located in a beautiful national park, and they're surrounded by stunning scenery. And what's even more amazing is that the locals have developed this unique approach to wellness that's all about connecting with nature.
Oh, I can see why you're so passionate about this. Leo, it's like you're saying, hey, let's not just relax. Let's connect with the natural world too.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that's so great about El Salvador. They're not just about relaxation. They're about finding balance and connection with nature.
Well, I think that's something we could all learn from. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that finding balance and connection with nature is essential for our well-being.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that's one of the things that's so great about Denmark too. They have this amazing approach to wellness that's all about finding balance and moderation in life.
Oh, I love that. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. Can you tell us more about the concept of Hygge in Denmark?
Sure thing. So Hygge is all about coziness and comfort. And it's a way of life in Denmark. It's like they're saying, hey, life's too short to be stressed out. Let's just relax and enjoy the moment.
I love that. And I think that's something we could all learn from. Don't you think, Leo?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that's one of the things that's so great about Denmark. They have this amazing approach to wellness that's all about finding balance and moderation in life.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that finding balance and moderation in life is essential for our well-being.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that's one of the things that's so great about Denmark and El Salvador. They both have this amazing approach to wellness that's all about finding balance and connection with nature.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this comparison of spa, healthy living, and relaxation opportunities in Denmark and El Salvador.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. And don't forget to check out our next episode where we'll be comparing to more countries on a different topic.
I'm curious. Leo, what comes to mind when you think of Denmark and spiritual needs? Do you associate it with the famous Copenhagen Cathedral?
Actually, Mira, I was more about the Danish concept of Hygge, a sense of coziness and togetherness that seems to permeate many aspects of life in Denmark, including faith and spirituality.
Ah, I see what you mean. The idea of Hygge is indeed unique to Denmark, and it's fascinating to see how it influences the way people live and interact with each other, including in a spiritual context. Can you tell me more about it?
Well, for instance, many Danes find comfort in the concept of solflensens or sjælefred, which is about finding meaning and purpose in life. It's not necessarily tied to a specific faith or denomination, but rather a sense of inner peace and contentment.
That's beautiful. It sounds like a wonderful approach to spirituality. And what about El Salvador? How does the country approach spiritual needs?
El Salvador has a rich spiritual heritage, with a strong emphasis on Catholicism and indigenous traditions. Many Salvadorans find comfort in the vibrant folk culture and traditional practices that blend Catholicism with pre-Columbian rituals.
That's really interesting. I've heard that El Salvador is home to some of the oldest churches in the Americas, including the Cathedral Metropolitane in San Salvador. Can you tell me more about the architecture and history of these churches?
Yes, the Cathedral Metropolitane is an impressive structure, and it's a great example of the mix of colonial and Baroque styles that can be found in many Salvadoran churches. And yes, El Salvador has a rich spiritual heritage, with many beautiful and historic churches.
I'm certain that our listeners living in El Salvador would agree with me that the country's spiritual landscape is incredibly diverse and vibrant. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the idea of Hygge in Denmark. Do they think it's something that could be applied to their own spiritual practices?
Well, let's turn to that. Mia, I think our listeners might be to learn that Denmark is home to a thriving community of spiritual seekers and practitioners who are exploring new forms of spirituality, including mindful, sands, and meditation.
That's fascinating. I've heard that Denmark has a strong tradition of secularism, but it seems that there's still a strong interest in spirituality and personal growth. And what about El Salvador? Are there any unique spiritual practices or traditions that you think our listeners might find interesting?
Yes. In El Salvador, you'll find many communities that practice a unique form of spirituality that blends Catholicism with indigenous traditions. For example, the captivates brotherhoods of Catholic laymen who organize processions on rituals are an important part of the country's spiritual landscape.
That's really fascinating. I've heard that the captivates are an important part of El Salvador's cultural heritage, and that they play a key role in the country's spiritual life. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the idea of community in both Denmark and El Salvador. Do they think that community is an essential part of spiritual growth and development?
Well, Mira, I think our listeners might agree that community is indeed an essential part of spiritual growth and development. In Denmark, for example, the concept of FLSKAB community is deeply tied to the idea of Hygge in the sense of coziness and togetherness that I mentioned earlier.
I see what you mean. The idea of community is indeed a powerful one. And it seems that both Denmark and El Salvador place a strong emphasis on building and nurturing community relationships. And what about the role of social media in spiritual practices? Do you think it's a helpful tool? Or is it more of a hindrance?
Well, Mira, I think social media can be a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to spiritual practices. On the one hand, it can be a powerful tool for connecting with others and sharing spiritual experiences and insights. On the other hand, it can also be a distraction and a source of conflict.
That's a great point. Leo, I think social media can be both a blessing and a curse when it comes to spiritual practices. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the idea of digital detox. Do they think it's something that could be beneficial for their spiritual growth and development?
Yes. I think many of our listeners might agree that digital detox is a great idea, especially when it comes to spiritual growth and development. In Denmark, for example, there's a growing trend towards digital pause, taking breaks from social media and technology to focus on spiritual practices and connection with others.
That's really interesting. I've heard that Denmark has a strong tradition of prioritizing work-life balance and taking breaks from technology. And what about El Salvador? Are there any unique spiritual practices or traditions that you think our listeners might find interesting?
Yes. In El Salvador, you'll find many communities that practice a unique form of spirituality that blends Catholicism with indigenous traditions. For example, the Maya traditional Mayan practice is an important part of the country's spiritual landscape.
That's really fascinating. I've heard that the Maya is an ancient practice that's still alive and well in El Salvador today. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the idea of ritual in both Denmark and El Salvador. Do they think it's an essential part of spiritual practices?
Well, Mira, I think our listeners might agree that ritual is indeed an essential part of spiritual practices. In Denmark, for example, many people find comfort in traditional rituals such as baptism, confirmation, and marriage.
I see what you mean. The idea of ritual is indeed a powerful one. And it seems that both Denmark and El Salvador place a strong emphasis on traditional rituals and practices. And what about the role of faith in community development? Do you think it's a key factor in building strong, resilient communities?
Yes. I think faith is indeed a key factor in building strong, resilient communities. In Denmark, for example, many communities have formed around shared values and faith. And these communities often provide a sense of support and belonging for their members.
That's really interesting. I've heard that Denmark has a strong tradition of community development and social cohesion, and that faith plays a key role in this process. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the idea of faith in both Denmark and El Salvador. Do they think it's an essential part of building strong, resilient communities?
Well, Mira, I think our listeners might agree that faith is indeed an essential part of building strong, resilient communities. In El Salvador, for example.
I'm curious to know how Denmark, a country known for its social welfare system, handles issues of social equality and minority rights. Leo, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, Mira, Denmark has made significant strides in promoting social equality and diversity. For instance, it has a strong focus on inclusive education, with programs like Integration Pedagogy, Hygge designed to help immigrant students adapt to the Danish language and culture.
That's fascinating. I've also heard that Denmark has a thriving LGBTQ community, with same-sex marriage being legal since 2012. But what about minority groups, like the Romani people, who often face challenges in integrating into Danish society?
Yes. The Romani community has faced significant challenges in Denmark, but the government has implemented initiatives to improve their integration and social inclusion. For example, the Romani strategy aims to promote the rights and interests of Romani people in Denmark.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me that social equality and respect for minorities are essential values in a modern society. Let's move on to El Salvador, a country with a rich cultural heritage and a history of social activism. What do you think about El Salvador's approach to social equality and minority rights? Leo?
Well, Mira, El Salvador has made significant progress in promoting social equality and diversity, particularly in the areas of LGBTQ rights and indigenous communities. For example, the government has implemented laws to protect the rights of LGBTQ individuals and has also recognized the rights of indigenous communities to their ancestral lands.
That's great to hear. Leo, I've also heard that El Salvador has a strong tradition of social activism, with many organizations working to promote social justice and human rights. But what about the challenges faced by minority groups in El Salvador, such as the Afro-Salvadoran community?
Ah, yes. The Afro-Salvadoran community has faced significant challenges in El Salvador, including racism and social exclusion. However, there are also many organizations and initiatives working to promote the rights and interests of Afro-Salvadoran individuals and communities.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. If you're living in El Salvador or have experience with the country's social dynamics, please share your thoughts in the comments. Leo, can you tell us more about the cultural celebrations in El Salvador that promote social equality and diversity?
Yes, Mira. El Salvador has many vibrant cultural celebrations that promote social equality and diversity, such as the Festival de la Diversidad, which celebrates the country's cultural diversity and promotes social inclusion.
That sounds like a fantastic event. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. But let's get back to Denmark and its approach to social equality and minority rights. What do you think about the country's handling of refugee crises? Leo?
Well, Mira, Denmark has faced challenges in handling refugee crises, but the government has also implemented initiatives to promote social inclusion and integration of refugees. For example, the Refugee Integration Program aims to provide refugees with language training, job skills, and cultural orientation.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me that social equality and respect for minorities are essential values in a modern society. But let's move on to El Salvador and its efforts to promote social equality and diversity through grassroots initiatives. What do you think about this? Leo?
Ah, yes. El Salvador has many grassroots initiatives working to promote social equality and diversity, such as the Movimiento de Mujeres, which works to promote women's rights and social justice.
That's inspiring. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about this movement. But let's get back to Denmark and its cultural celebrations that promote social equality and diversity. What do you think about the country's tradition of Hygge, which emphasizes community and social connection?
Ah, yes. The concept of Hygge is fascinating. Mira, it emphasizes the importance of community and social connection, which is essential for promoting social equality and diversity.
I couldn't agree more. Leo, and speaking of community, let's talk about the importance of social media in promoting social equality and diversity in both Denmark and El Salvador. What do you think about this, Leo?
Well, Mira, social media has been a powerful tool in promoting social equality and diversity in both Denmark and El Salvador. For example, social media campaigns have helped to raise awareness about LGBTQ rights and indigenous communities in El Salvador.
That's a great point. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the impact of social media on social equality and diversity in both countries. So let's dive into the world of taxation, retirement, and social rights for long-term immigrants in Denmark and El Salvador, and to see how these two countries approach supporting their immigrant residents.
Ah, great topic. Denmark, being one of the most progressive countries in the world, has a very comprehensive system in place. They have a tax-based social welfare system, which provides a high level of social security for its citizens.
That's fascinating. I'm curious, Leo, how do they handle taxation for non-EU immigrants? Do they have any specific programs or incentives to attract them?
Well, Denmark has a special tax regime for highly skilled workers, which allows them to receive a tax-free salary of up to DKK 51,000 per month. This is a huge incentive for top talent to move to Denmark.
Well, that sounds like a great opportunity. But what about retirement benefits? How do they ensure that long-term immigrants have access to a comfortable retirement?
That's a great question. Denmark has a well-established pension system, which includes a mandatory pension scheme for all employees. This ensures that everyone has access to a decent pension, regardless of their nationality.
That's reassuring to hear. And what about social rights? How do they ensure that immigrant residents have access to healthcare, education, and other essential services?
Denmark has a robust social safety net, which includes universal healthcare, free education, and a range of other benefits. They also have a system of integration, which helps immigrant residents to learn the language, find a job, and settle into their new life.
I'm impressed by Denmark's approach to social welfare. But let's move on to El Salvador. How do they handle taxation and social rights for long-term immigrants?
El Salvador has a more challenging situation. To be honest, they have a relatively high tax burden, and their social welfare system is not as comprehensive as Denmark's. However, they do have a pension system in place, which provides some level of social security for their citizens.
I see. And what about healthcare? How do long-term immigrants in El Salvador access medical care?
Well, El Salvador has a public healthcare system, which provides some level of access to medical care. However, the quality of care can be variable, and many people rely on private health care services.
I'm curious. Leo, how do long-term immigrants in El Salvador access education? Are there any programs or incentives to support their children's education?
That's a great question. El Salvador has a public education system, which is free for all citizens. However, the quality of education can be variable, and many families rely on private schools to give their children a better education.
I see. And what about social rights? How do long-term immigrants in El Salvador access essential services like housing and employment?
Well, El Salvador has a range of social programs in place, which provide support for families in need. However, the availability and quality of these services can vary depending on the region and the individual circumstances.
I'm impressed by the efforts of both countries to support their immigrant residents. But let's not forget, our listeners are the ones who will be living in these countries. I'm curious, what do you think our listeners living in Denmark would say about the tax system and social welfare benefits?
I think they would say that the tax system is quite complex, but the benefits are well worth it. They would appreciate the high level of social security and the comprehensive pension system.
And what about our listeners living in El Salvador? What do you think would say about the social welfare system and access to essential services?
I think they would say that the system is more challenging to navigate, but there are still many resources available to support immigrant residents.
Thank you, Leo, for shedding some light on the taxation, retirement, and social rights for long-term immigrants in Denmark and El Salvador. I'm sure our listeners will find this information very helpful in making their decision.
You're welcome, Mira. And don't forget to check the comments section for more information and personal experiences from our listeners.
Hey everyone, welcome back to our comparison podcast. Today, we're exploring the rate of meeting specific interests in Denmark and El Salvador. I'm Mira, and I'm to dive into this topic with my co-host, Leo.
That's right. Mira, our listeners are in for a treat as we delve into the unique ways these countries cater to enthusiasts and community engagement. From niche hobby clubs to specialized events, we're going to discover what makes each country stand out.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me that the country's emphasis on HYGCGE, or coziness, creates a warm and welcoming atmosphere for people to explore their interests, whether it's trying new foods, attending cultural events, or simply enjoying the great outdoors. Denmark's got something for everyone.
That's a great point. Mira, and speaking of great outdoors, El Salvador has got its own unique charm. With its stunning beaches, volcanic landscapes, and lush rainforests, it's a nature lover's paradise. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the outdoor activities and adventure sports available in El Salvador.
Absolutely. Leo, and did you know that Denmark has a thriving community of makers and DIY enthusiasts? From woodworking to knitting, there are countless groups and workshops where people can share their passion for creating something with their hands.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about Denmark's maker culture. And in El Salvador, we have the Feria de la Flor, a beautiful flower festival that showcases the country's rich cultural heritage. It's a must-see event for anyone interested in art, music, and dance.
That's so cool. Leo, and I'm curious. What do you think about the role of community engagement in Denmark and El Salvador? Do you think it plays a significant part in fostering a sense of belonging among locals and expats alike?
Ah, great question. Mira, in Denmark, community engagement is deeply ingrained in the culture. From neighborhood associations to local sports teams, there are countless ways for people to get involved and connect with others who share similar interests.
That's wonderful. And in El Salvador, we have a strong tradition of family and community ties. Many families come together to celebrate special occasions, like the Feria de la Flor, and share their love of music, dance, and food.
That's so heartwarming. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the unique events and festivals that take place in both countries. For example, Denmark's annual Copenhagen Jazz Festival is a world-renowned event that attracts jazz enthusiasts from all over the globe.
Wow, that sounds incredible. And in El Salvador, we have the Festival de las Flores, a vibrant celebration of music, dance, and art that takes place in the capital city of San Salvador.
Ah, what a point. Mira, and speaking of art, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the thriving art scene in both countries. From galleries to street art, Denmark and El Salvador have a rich cultural heritage that's waiting to be discovered.
Absolutely. Leo? And did you know that Denmark has a strong tradition of folk music and dance? From the traditional polka to the modern-day pop music, there's a rich cultural heritage that's waiting to be explored.
Wow, that's amazing. And in El Salvador, we have a unique blend of indigenous and Spanish influences in our music and dance. From the traditional Garifuna music to the modern-day salsa and merengue, there's something for everyone.
That's so cool. Leo, and I'm curious, what do you think about the role of technology in meeting specific interests in both countries? Do you think it plays a significant part in connecting people with like-minded individuals?
Ah, great question. Mira, in Denmark, technology has made it easier than ever for people to connect with others who share similar interests. From online forums to social media groups, there are countless ways for people to meet and engage with others who share their passions.
That's so true. Leo! And in El Salvador, we have a strong tradition of community-based initiatives that use technology to connect people with like-minded individuals. From online platforms to mobile apps, there are countless ways for people to meet and engage with others who share their interests.
Ah, what a great point. Mira, and speaking of community-based initiatives, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the various organizations and initiatives that support specific interests in both countries. For example, Denmark's Kulturministeriet is a government agency that promotes cultural heritage and supports various initiatives that foster community engagement.
Wow, that's amazing. And in El Salvador, we have the Fundación de la Cultura Salvador, NA, which is a non-profit organization that promotes cultural heritage and supports various initiatives that foster community engagement.
Ah, what a great point. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the various events and festivals that take place in both countries. For example, Denmark's Roskilde Festival is a world-renowned music festival that attracts music enthusiasts from all over the globe.
Well, that sounds incredible. And in El Salvador, we have the Feria de la Flor, which is a beautiful flower festival that showcases the country's rich cultural heritage.
Ah, what a great point. Mira, and speaking of cultural heritage, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the unique traditions and customs that take place in both countries. For example, Denmark's Midsommer is a traditional midsummer celebration that takes place on the summer solstice.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And in El Salvador, we have the Fiestas del Virgen de la Asunción, which is a beautiful celebration of the country's patron saint.
Ah, what a great point. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the various sports and fitness activities that take place in both countries. For example, Denmark's Copenhagen Marathon is a popular running event that attracts athletes from all over the world.
Wow, that sounds incredible. And in El Salvador, we have the Festival Día o Música, which is a vibrant celebration of music and dance that takes place in the capital city of San Salvador.
Ah, what a great point. Mira, and speaking of music, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the unique musical traditions that take place in both countries. For example, Denmark's folk music is a traditional form of folk music that has been passed down through generations.
Well, that sounds amazing. And in El Salvador, we have the marimba, which is a traditional instrument that is an integral part of the country's musical heritage.
Ah, what a great point. Mira, and I'm sure